There is a country at the edge of Europe where the mountains don't merely frame the landscape, they define the soul of an entire people. Where the roads twist upward through limestone crags that have swallowed armies whole, where ancient passes breathe with the cold patience of centuries, and where a double-headed eagle spread across a blood-red flag has watched civilizations rise, stumble, and burn for more than 3,000 years. This is Albania. And most of the world has barely heard of it. That invisibility is itself a kind of story. Imagine a land smaller than the state of Maryland, wedged between the Adriatic Sea to the west and a ring of formidable mountains to the east and north, pinned between Greece, North Macedonia, Kosovo, and Montenegro, occupying one of the most strategically critical crossroads in the ancient and medieval Mediterranean world. Imagine that this tiny corridor has been invaded, occupied, resisted, converted, divided, sealed shut, and torn open again so many times that its people developed something rare in the human experience, a philosophy of survival written not in books, but in blood and stone. This is the story of Albania. Not the postcard Albania of turquoise Riviera bays and Ottoman bazaars, though those exist too. This is the story of a people who descended from the oldest known inhabitants of the Balkans, who produced one of the most celebrated military commanders in European history, a man who held off the Ottoman Empire single-handedly for 2 decades and became a legend in his own lifetime, who then endured nearly 5 centuries of Ottoman rule with their language, their customs, and their identity somehow still intact, who declared independence just over a century ago, then watched their fragile newborn state be carved up, occupied, and fought over before it was a decade old, who survived fascist invasion, Nazi occupation, and then, most extraordinarily, inflicted upon themselves one of the most brutal and isolated communist dictatorships the 20th century ever produced. A regime so paranoid it built more than 700,000 concrete bunkers across a nation of barely 3 million people, 1 for every 4 citizens, and still it feared the world outside. And when that regime finally fell, Albania didn't slide gently into democracy. It detonated. The 1990s brought not liberation but anarchy, a collapse so total that the army dissolved, the government vanished, and ordinary Albanians dug guns out of abandoned military depots and turned on each other in a violence that shocked even the Balkans, which had seen quite enough violence in that decade. Hundreds of thousands fled. The country nearly ceased to exist as a functioning state, and yet here it is, still standing, still eagle-proud, still complicated, still, in so many ways, misunderstood. How does a nation survive all of that? What does it mean to endure? What is the cost of resilience? And what does a people lose, and what do they hold on to when history keeps taking everything from them? To find those answers, we have to go back, all the way back, before the Ottomans, before the Romans, before even the Greeks left their famous accounts. We have to go back to the Illyrians. The Illyrians are one of history's great mysteries wrapped inside a history that most people never think about. They were here before written records bothered to record them, a collection of tribes who inhabited the Western Balkans, the lands we now call Albania, Kosovo, Western North Macedonia, Montenegro, and parts of Serbia and Croatia for centuries before the great civilizations of antiquity took serious notice. We don't know what they called themselves in aggregate. Illyrian is largely a Greek and Roman designation, an outside label applied to a complex mosaic of peoples who shared certain cultural and linguistic patterns but were not a unified nation in any modern sense. They were the Ardii and the Talantii, the Partheni and the Ancilii, the Dasaritii and the Labiates, and many others, tribes and kingdoms with their own internal structures, their own rivalries, their own alliances. What we do know about them is this: they were fierce. They were skilled metalworkers and craftsmen. Their warriors were renowned across the ancient Mediterranean world, feared by the Greeks who occasionally employed them as mercenaries, and eventually challenged by the Romans who found them impossible to simply absorb. Their territory was rich in silver, copper, and iron, and they possessed something that would prove both their greatest asset and their most dangerous liability across 3,000 years of history. They lived in the mountains. The mountains of what is now Albania are not simply geographic features. They are a force of nature with a personality. The Albanian Alps in the north, known locally as the Bjeshket I Namuna, the Accursed Mountains, rise to nearly 2,700 meters and form one of the most rugged, isolated landscapes in all of Europe. Even today, certain valleys in the northern Albanian highlands are accessible only on foot or by four-wheel drive on roads that cling to cliff edges above vertiginous drops. For thousands of years, these mountains were essentially impenetrable to large organized armies. They were the original refuge. They were where people went when the outside world became unbearable. And the outside world became unbearable with remarkable frequency. The Illyrian tribes who controlled these passes and valleys understood their geography with the intimacy of people who had lived inside it for generations. When Greek colonies began appearing along the Albanian coast in the 7th and 6th centuries BC, Epidamnos, modern-day Durrës, founded around 627 BC, Apollonia, founded around 588 BCE, both eventually becoming major centers of trade and culture, the Illyrians didn't simply disappear. They adapted. They traded. They contested. They absorbed elements of Greek culture while maintaining their own. The relationship was complex, neither purely hostile nor purely cooperative, but rather the kind of friction that arises when two very different civilizations share a border and both want the same valuable coastline. Apollonia, set in the hills above the Seaman River, became one of the most significant cities in the ancient Adriatic world. Its coins circulated across the Mediterranean. Its philosophers attracted students from as far as Rome. Julius Caesar himself would eventually send his young nephew Octavian, the future Augustus, to study there. The city's famous temple to Apollonia was renowned across the ancient world. And all of this flourished in what is essentially the heartland of modern Albania, on land that Illyrian tribes had claimed as their own for centuries before the Greeks arrived. The Illyrian kingdoms that emerged in the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE were no primitive chieftaincies. They were genuine political entities capable of projecting military power across the Adriatic and negotiating on equal terms with the great powers of the ancient Mediterranean. The kingdom of Agrin, ruler of the Aryi tribe in the early 3rd century BCE, built an Illyrian fleet powerful enough to conduct raids throughout the Adriatic and Ionian seas. His ships, the nimble, fast Liburnian galleys, terrified coastal settlements from the Peloponnese to southern Italy. When the Greek city of Medaion was besieged by the Aetolian League, it was Agrin who broke the siege, sweeping down with 100 ships and 5,000 soldiers, defeating an enemy that the major Greek powers hadn't bothered to challenge. But it was not Agrin who had captured the imagination of the ancient world. It was his widow. Tuta of Illyria is one of the most fascinating and controversial figures in ancient Balkan history, a queen who, upon her husband Ag's premature death around 230 BCE, seized the regency and immediately expanded Illyrian raiding operations to an unprecedented scale. Roman envoys sent to negotiate with her were insulted. By one account, one was killed on her orders. Whether that story is entirely accurate or Roman propaganda designed to justify what came next, the effect was the same. Rome declared war. The First Illyrian War of 229 BCE was a relatively swift Roman military demonstration, a fleet of 200 warships and 20,000 soldiers descending on Illyrian territory with the intention of making a very clear point. Tuta's forces could not match that kind of power in open battle, and she was forced to accept humiliating peace terms, ceding most of her coastal territories and agreeing to pay tribute. She disappears from history shortly after, her fate unknown, but her legend endures. In modern Albania, she is remembered not as a defeated queen but as a symbol of resistance, fierce, uncompromising, refusing to be intimidated by the largest military machine the ancient world had produced. There is a brewery named for her. There is a political party. There are statues. That pattern, the pattern of fierce resistance, ultimate defeat, but cultural immortality, would repeat itself in Albanian history with almost mythological regularity. The Romans were not done with Illyria. After a second Illyrian war in 219 BCE and decades of further conflict, Rome finally subjugated the Western Balkans and organized the region into the province of Illyricum, later divided into Dalmatia and Pannonia, with the southern portion, essentially modern Albania, eventually organized as Epirus Nova, or simply incorporated into Macedonia. Roman roads sliced through the mountain passes that had previously defined Illyrian independence. The Via Egnatia, the great Roman highway connecting the Adriatic port of Dyrrhachium, modern Durrës, all the way to Thessaloniki and eventually Byzantium, ran straight through the heart of Albanian territory. It was one of the most important roads in the Roman world, and it crossed Albanian mountains for hundreds of miles. What happened to the Illyrians under Rome? The answer is complex and still actively debated by scholars. Roman provincial rule brought infrastructure, urban development, Latin language, and eventually Christianity. The coastal cities of Durrës and Apollonia became important Roman centers. Illyrian nobles adopted Latin names and Roman customs. But in the mountains, always in the mountains, older patterns persisted. Languages that were neither Latin nor Greek continued to be spoken. Traditions that Rome never bothered to dismantle quietly survived. This is the argument, fiercely contested but deeply important to Albanian national identity, that the Albanians are the direct descendants of those Illyrian mountain dwellers, that through the Roman period, through the migrations and invasions of late antiquity, through the arrival of Slavic peoples in the 6th and 7th centuries CE who fundamentally transformed the ethnic composition of most of the Balkans, the ancestors of today's Albanians maintained their distinct identity in their mountain fastnesses and eventually re-emerged in the medieval period as a recognizably distinct people with a recognizably distinct language. Albanian Ichkip has no close relatives in the Indo-European family tree. It is its own branch, ancient and isolated, preserving linguistic fossils that give linguists extraordinary insights into the Indo-European proto-language. It is not derived from Latin. It is not derived from Greek. It is not Slavic. It is something older, and its very antiquity is a form of evidence for that unbroken continuity. The Illyrian-Albanian continuity thesis is contested, and honestly, the historical record has enough gaps that absolute certainty is impossible. But the alternative, that the Albanians simply appeared from nowhere in the medieval period with no ancient roots in their territory, is even harder to defend. Something of those ancient mountain peoples persisted. Exactly what, and in what form, and through what channels, remains one of the most fascinating open questions in Balkan historiography. What is certain is that by the late Roman period and the era of late antiquity, the territory of modern Albania had become one of the most strategically contested corridors in the world. The Via Egnatia made it vital. The Adriatic coast made it desirable. And when the Roman Empire began to fragment, when the distinctions between East and West solidified into permanent division with the death of Theodosius I in 395 CE, the line of partition ran almost directly through Albanian territory. The eastern shore of the Adriatic became a boundary zone, ecclesiastically contested between Rome and Constantinople, politically pulled between the Western and Eastern empires, and militarily exposed to every wave of migration and invasion that swept across the Balkans in the 5th, 6th, and 7th centuries. The Visigoths came through. The Huns came through. The Ostrogoths moved across Albanian territory. The Avars raided deep into the Balkans. And then, beginning in the late 6th century, something transformative occurred. The South Slavs arrived in enormous numbers, flooding into the Balkans and permanently reshaping the demographic map of the entire peninsula. By the 7th century, most of what had been Roman Illyricum was largely Slavicized. New peoples with new languages occupied the old Illyrian tribal territories. Greek cities on the coast shrank or were abandoned. The elaborate Roman infrastructure decayed and was reclaimed by forest and scrub. In the mountains, the people who would become the Albanians watched and waited. This is perhaps the strangest and most remarkable chapter in Albanian prehistory, the long silence. For roughly 3 centuries, between approximately the 7th century and the 10th century CE, the written sources tell us almost nothing about the Albanian highlands. The Byzantines, whose empire continued to control the Adriatic coast with varying degrees of effectiveness, occasionally referenced the mountains but described them as essentially empty of significance. The Slavic newcomers settled the lowlands and valleys. The old Illyrian population, or whatever remained of it, retreated further into the Alpine interior. And then, slowly, the silence broke. Byzantine chronicles of the 11th century begin to mention a people called the Arbanitai or Albanoi, dwelling in the highland regions of what is now central Albania around the city of Cluj. By the 12th century, these references multiply. By the 13th century, it is clear that a distinct Albanian-speaking population exists in the highlands, maintaining its own pastoral traditions, its own legal customs, and its own fierce independence from every external power attempting to claim sovereignty over the Western Balkans. Where had they been for those centuries of silence? Living, surviving, maintaining in their high valleys and forested mountains the most essential elements of their identity: language, custom, kinship. The canon, the extraordinary code of customary law that would govern Albanian highland society well into the 20th century, almost certainly has roots stretching back into this obscure period. It is not Roman law. It is not Byzantine law. It is not Slavic law. It is something indigenous, something that evolved in the mountains over centuries of relative isolation, a system of honor and obligation and blood feud and hospitality so elaborate and so deeply embedded in the culture that it functioned as a complete alternative civilization to whatever powers nominally claimed rule over the highlands. By the 13th century, the medieval Albanian principalities were beginning to take shape. The Thopia, the Muzaka, the Dukagini, the Arianite, these were the great dynastic families of medieval Albanian political life, each controlling territories in the highlands and increasingly extending their reach to the Adriatic coast as the Byzantine Empire weakened and the Latin Crusader states established themselves in the wake of the Fourth Crusade's catastrophic sack of Constantinople in 1204. Albanian nobles served in Byzantine armies, married into Byzantine aristocratic families, and gradually built a complex web of political relationships across the fragmented successor states of the Byzantine world. Serbian expansion under the remarkable medieval ruler Stefan Dusan brought Albanian territory under nominal Serbian suzerainty in the 14th century. Dusan's empire, briefly one of the most powerful entities in the medieval Balkans, stretched across much of the Western Balkans including modern Albania. But it was a relatively loose overlordship. The Albanian Highlanders acknowledged Serbian supremacy when it was convenient and ignored it when it was not, and after Dusan's death in 1355 and the rapid fragmentation of the Serbian Empire, the Albanian principalities reasserted their independence with characteristic speed. This was the world into which Gjergj Kastrioti was born, approximately in 1405, to a powerful Albanian lord named Gjergj Kastrioti, who controlled territories around Cluj in central Albania. And what happened to this young man over the next 3 decades is so improbable, so dramatic, so shot through with reversals and transformations that it reads like a work of fiction rather than history, except that the consequences were entirely, devastatingly real. Gjergj Kastrioti, like many Albanian nobles in this period, found himself in a complicated relationship with the Ottoman Empire, which was advancing with terrifying speed across the Balkans in the early 15th century. The Ottomans had crossed into Europe at Gallipoli in 1354. They had defeated the Serbs at the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, a battle that would become the founding myth of Serbian national consciousness. They had crushed a major crusade at Nicopolis in 1396. By the early 1400s, the Ottoman advance seemed unstoppable, and smaller Balkan lords like Gjergj Kastrioti faced a stark choice: submit, fight, or die. Gjergj submitted, at least formally. As a condition of his submission and as a guarantee of his loyalty, he sent several of his sons to the Ottoman court at Edirne as hostages, following a well-established Ottoman practice of binding vassal lords through their children. Gjergj was among those sent, probably in the mid-1410s, when he was perhaps 10 years old. He was taken from his Albanian home, brought to the Ottoman court, converted to Islam, given a new name Skanderbeg, a Turkification of Alexander, honoring Alexander the Great, and trained in the finest military academy the Ottoman world possessed. Think about what that means for a moment. The boy who would become Albania's greatest national hero spent his formative years not in Albanian mountains but in Ottoman palaces and military training grounds. He learned Ottoman military tactics. He mastered Ottoman cavalry techniques. He rose through the ranks of the Ottoman military with extraordinary speed, commanding troops in Anatolia, in the Balkans, in the endless succession of campaigns that kept the Ottoman war machine in constant motion. He was given the rank of Sanjaqbi, military governor of a provincial district. He was trusted, valued, promoted. He became, to outward appearance, a loyal and successful Ottoman officer. And for roughly 20 years, that is what he was. What changed? What turned this successful Ottoman commander back into Kastrioti? Back into the man who would call himself Skanderbeg, a westernization of Iskanderbeg, and spend the rest of his life fighting the empire that had raised and shaped him. The historical record offers some evidence, but not a complete picture. His father John had died, as had his brothers, and the family territories were absorbed into the Ottoman provincial system. His homeland, his inheritance, the world he had come from, was being erased. And in 1443, at the Battle of Niš, fighting for the Ottomans against a Hungarian-led crusade, something happened. The Ottomans were defeated. In the confusion of that defeat, Skanderbeg slipped away with 300 Albanian horsemen, forged or obtained a letter bearing the Ottoman governor's seal ordering the commandant of Cluj to surrender the fortress to him, and rode hard for Albania. He arrived at Cluj in November 1443. He converted back to Christianity, or publicly declared the faith he may never have truly abandoned. He raised the double-headed eagle flag of the Kastrioti family over the fortress of Cluj, and he sent word across the Albanian principalities that it was time to resist. What followed was one of the most remarkable military careers in European history. For 25 years, from 1443 until his death in 1468, Skanderbeg led Albanian resistance against the Ottoman Empire with a combination of tactical genius, personal charisma, and sheer tenacious stubbornness that defied every military logic of the age. He was outnumbered. He was out-resourced. His coalition of Albanian lords was fractious, unreliable, and frequently fractured by internal rivalries. He received fitful and often inadequate support from Western powers who recognized his strategic importance but consistently failed to provide the sustained assistance that might have made a decisive difference. And yet, against all odds, he kept winning. His method was not frontal battle in the open field. Skanderbeg was far too intelligent for that, and he had learned Ottoman tactics from the inside. Instead, he exploited the Albanian terrain with ferocious ingenuity. He struck Ottoman supply lines. He ambushed columns in mountain passes. He refused battle when the odds were impossible and fought when he had chosen his ground and his moment. He used the network of Albanian highland fortresses, above all, as anchors around which his mobile forces operated. He was a master of the quick withdrawal and the devastating counterstrike, of making the Ottomans exhaust themselves chasing an enemy who would not stand and be destroyed. The Ottomans tried 3 major sieges of Cluj in 1450, in 1466, and in 1467. 3 times, the fortress held. 3 times, the Ottoman army withdrew without achieving its objective. This was extraordinary. The Ottomans in this period were perhaps the finest military machine in the world, experienced, well-supplied, expertly led under sultans like Murad II and Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople. Constantinople itself had fallen to Mehmed in 1453, the culmination of a 1,000-year Byzantine story, an event that sent shockwaves across Christendom. And yet this Albanian lord in his mountain fortress kept frustrating him, Skanderbeg became a celebrity in Western Europe, celebrated by popes, sought as an ally by kings, written about in pamphlets and chronicles as a Christian champion against the Ottoman tide. Pope Calixtus III called him athlete of Christ. Nicholas V wrote to him directly. Alfonso V of Aragon sent support. Venice, perpetually balancing its commercial relationship with the Ottomans against its need for a buffer state in the Balkans, swung between alliance and negotiation with characteristic Venetian calculation. The Holy League, those alliances of Christian powers that periodically coalesced against Ottoman expansion, looked to Skanderbeg as their most valuable Balkan champion. But Western support was never enough, and Western interest was always contingent on Western priorities. When those priorities shifted, when a new pope died, when Venice reached a separate accommodation with the Porte, when Aragon was consumed by internal politics, Albania was left to manage alone. Skanderbeg accepted these limitations with the pragmatism of a man who had learned to expect little and survive anyway. He died in January 1468, in the coastal city of Luzha, probably of malaria. He was perhaps 63 years old. He had spent 25 years in almost continuous warfare. He had never been defeated in pitched battle. His record in direct military engagements was essentially unbroken. And with his death, the resistance he had built began to unravel with shocking speed. There is a specific moment after Skanderbeg's death that captures the catastrophe with particular force. Mehmed II, the same sultan whose forces had failed 3 times to take Cluj, received the news of Skanderbeg's death and is reported to have said, "Finally Europe and Asia belong to me. For woe to Christendom, she has lost her sword and her shield." Whether or not Mehmed actually said this, the sentiment it captures is historically accurate. The Albanian resistance that Skanderbeg had sustained by force of personality and military genius could not be maintained after him. There was no one of comparable stature to replace him. The coalition of Albanian lords, which had held together so precariously during his lifetime, fragmented almost immediately after his death. It is worth pausing here to ask, what did Skanderbeg actually achieve? He held the Ottomans back for 25 years. In doing so, he may have bought time for other parts of Europe, Venice, Naples, Rome, to strengthen their defenses and prevent Ottoman expansion into Italy, a scenario that was genuinely feared during his lifetime and that his resistance arguably made less likely. He became a symbol of Christian resistance that inspired other Balkan peoples and sustained the idea that Ottoman expansion could be resisted. And he gave the Albanian people a founding myth of extraordinary power, a man who chose his homeland over his adopted empire, who transformed himself back into what he had been, who died fighting. The myth matters as much as the man, perhaps more. Because what happened after his death required myth to survive. The celebration of Skanderbeg spread across Renaissance Europe with remarkable speed. The Historia de Vita et Gestis Skanderbegi Apparatorum Principis, the official biography written by Marinus Barlady, an Albanian priest who had witnessed parts of the resistance before the fall of Shkodër, was published in Rome around 1508 and became one of the most widely read biographical works of the 16th century. It was translated into numerous European languages and went through multiple editions. Skanderbeg's story was adapted into plays, poems, operas, and paintings across Europe for 2 centuries after his death. He appeared as a hero in French, Italian, German, and English literature. His name became synonymous with Christian military virtue, with the idea that a single man of sufficient courage and ability could hold back the largest empire in the world. In the 20th century, this European legend was reclaimed by Albanians themselves as the central pillar of national identity. Communist Albania, despite its official atheism and its rejection of virtually every pre-communist cultural tradition, maintains Skanderbeg as the one historical figure that even Hoxha's regime found too useful to suppress. Skanderbeg was reframed as a defender of the Albanian people against foreign domination, a nationalist hero rather than a Christian one, his religious motivations systematically downplayed in favor of his patriotic role. The enormous equestrian statue in Skanderbeg Square in Tirana, erected in 1968 to commemorate the 500th anniversary of his death, became the most prominent public monument in the country. This appropriation was convenient but also, in some ways, true. Whatever Skanderbeg's religious motivations, and they were real, he genuinely understood himself as fighting for Christianity. His practical achievement was the defense of Albanian territory and Albanian people against incorporation into the Ottoman system. The fact that the communists found his legacy useful doesn't diminish that achievement. It perhaps confirms that some aspects of Albanian identity run deeper than any particular political system and persist through every ideological transformation. Within a decade of Skanderbeg's death, the major Albanian coastal cities, Durrës, Lozhë, Shkodër, fell to Ottoman forces. The resistance continued in fragments, in the mountains, sustained by local lords who lacked Skanderbeg's unifying genius, but it was fundamentally over. By the early 1500s, the Ottoman Empire controlled all of modern Albania. The process that followed, the slow, complex, often violent transformation of Albanian society under Ottoman rule, would unfold across the next 4.5 centuries, 450 years. Let that sink in. Albanian society lived under Ottoman governance from roughly 1479 until 1912. For most of that time, it was not a period of simple oppression and resistance, though those elements were certainly present. It was something far more complicated, a deep intertwining of Albanian identity with Ottoman structures, a process of partial assimilation that produced a society uniquely shaped by its position at the edge of empire. One of the most significant changes was religious. Under Ottoman rule, the Islamic faith spread gradually across Albanian society, not uniformly, not everywhere simultaneously, and rarely through outright force, but through the slow accumulation of incentives. Muslims faced lower taxes. Muslims had better access to Ottoman administrative positions. Muslims could own land on more favorable terms. Islam, in the Ottoman system, was not just a faith but a socio-economic category, and conversion, for many Albanians, was a pragmatic decision as much as a spiritual one. The result, by the time the Ottoman Empire began to decline in the 19th century, was a religious landscape unique in the Balkans. Albania was majority Muslim, by some estimates 60 to 70%, but with substantial Catholic populations in the north and Orthodox populations in the south. And within this already complex picture, a syncretic Sufi order called the Bektashi had established deep roots in Albanian religious life, offering a form of Islam that was tolerant, philosophically flexible, and open to pre-Islamic Albanian folk traditions. The Bektashi headquarters eventually relocated to Albania, and today Albania remains the global center of the Bektashi order. This religious diversity, Islam, Catholicism, Orthodoxy, Bektashism, did not produce the sectarian violence that characterized so many other multi-religious societies. It produced instead a kind of interfaith pragmatism captured in a famous Albanian proverb, Feja I shqiptarit e, the religion of the Albanian is Albanianism. Identity came first. Faith was something that could be negotiated, adapted, worn lightly or heavily as circumstances demanded. This was not irreligion. Many Albanians were and are devout in their respective faiths. But it was a culturally specific relationship to religion shaped by centuries of navigating an empire where your religion determined your status, and where survival sometimes required performing one faith while privately honoring another. The Albanians who rose highest in the Ottoman system were often those who had most completely adopted Ottoman identity, who had converted, who had learned Turkish, who had moved to Istanbul and built careers in the imperial capital. And yet these men, even as they became Ottoman grandees, often maintained their Albanian connections, sent remittances back to Albanian villages, patronized Albanian cultural projects, and in some cases, when the empire began to crumble, remembered the homeland that had produced them. The Albanian presence at the highest levels of the Ottoman state was remarkable. The Ottoman Empire produced at least 36 Grand Viziers of Albanian origin, including Ali Pasha Tepelin, one of the most colorful and terrifying figures of the late Ottoman period, who carved out a virtual independent kingdom in the Albanian and Greek borderlands at the turn of the 19th century, waged private wars against the Porte and against local populations, attracted the attention of the English poet Lord Byron, and was finally executed in 1822 in an operation that required the Sultan to deploy a substantial army to bring him down. The Ottoman centuries were not simply a time of subordination. They were a time of transformation, economic, religious, cultural, linguistic. And to understand what those transformations meant for real Albanian lives, you have to understand the texture of Albanian society as the empire reshaped it across those long centuries. Because this was not simply an experience of oppression. It was something more intimate, more complicated, more genuinely ambiguous than a simple story of resistance and conquest would allow. Consider the men who rose highest in the Ottoman system. Ali Pasha Tepelin, the Lion of Ioannina, is perhaps the most spectacular example of what the Albanian-Ottoman symbiosis could produce at its extreme. Born around 1740 in the town of Tepelin in southern Albania, Ali was the son of a local military figure who had been killed in interclan violence, leaving a family vulnerable to the predatory politics of Ottoman provincial life. From that precarious beginning, through a combination of ruthlessness, intelligence, tactical brilliance, and an absolute willingness to do whatever circumstances required, Ali climbed through the Ottoman provincial power structure until he controlled, de facto independently, though nominally as Ottoman governor, a territory encompassing most of modern Albania, most of modern Greece, and large portions of northwestern North Macedonia. His court at Ioannina, in what is now northwestern Greece, was legendary. He was simultaneously feared and admired, despised and courted, a man who could order executions with an almost aesthetic detachment and who could also patronize poetry, discourse learnedly on political philosophy, and negotiate with Napoleonic France and Ottoman Constantinople simultaneously. The British poet Lord Byron visited him in 1809, part of his celebrated Mediterranean tour, and described their meeting with fascinated horror. Byron found Ali a remorseless tyrant, guilty of the most horrible cruelties but also very kind to me. His personal charm was apparently real even to those who saw clearly what he was. Byron's observations made their way into Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, giving Ali Pasha Tepelin a place in the Western literary imagination that was out of all proportion to his actual political significance but entirely consistent with his capacity to fascinate. Ali Pasha's story ended badly, as such stories tend to. By the 1820s, his relationship with the Ottoman Sultan had deteriorated into outright hostility, and Sultan Mahmud II dispatched a large army to bring him to heel. Ali held out in his island fortress at Ioannina for months in a siege that drew international attention, including the sympathy of Greek nationalists who saw in the confusion and distraction of the Ottoman forces around Ioannina an opportunity for their own uprising. Ali Pasha was finally killed in February 1822, after being lured into negotiations that turned treacherous, shot through the floor of the building in which he was meeting with Ottoman emissaries. His head was sent to Constantinople as proof of the achievement, but Ali Pasha was only the most vivid example of a broader phenomenon. Albanian men in the Ottoman system held positions as high as any in the empire. Koprulu Mehmed Pasha, the founder of the famous Koprulu dynasty of Grand Viziers that essentially saved the Ottoman Empire from collapse in the mid-17th century, was of Albanian origin. The Koprulu family produced 5 Grand Viziers across 3 generations, steering the empire through wars with Venice, Poland, and Habsburg Austria, and their Albanian roots were known and acknowledged. They were not anomalies but representatives of a pattern: Albanian men who entered the Ottoman military or administrative system young, who converted to Islam, who became thoroughly Ottoman in their professional identities while maintaining awareness of their origins, and who sometimes rose to the very apex of imperial power. What did this do to Albanian identity? This is one of the most fascinating questions in Albanian cultural history. The answer, strangely, is that it may have reinforced it. The Ottoman system operated on the millet principle. Subjects of the empire were organized into religious communities, and their religious community determined their legal status and their obligations. This meant that the category Albanian had no formal Ottoman administrative reality. There were Albanian Muslims, Albanian Orthodox Christians, Albanian Catholics, but there was no Ottoman administrative category for Albanian as such. Albanian identity was, in a sense, officially invisible to the empire that governed the territory, and so Albanian identity became something cultivated privately, in the home, in the village, in the mountains. The Albanian language survived because it was spoken in spaces the Ottoman bureaucracy didn't penetrate, around evening fires, in women's domestic circles, in the confidential exchanges between men who trusted each other, in the songs and epics that served as the primary vehicle for collective memory. The great cycle of Albanian folk epic poetry, the Kenj Kreshnik, the songs of the border warriors, preserve the memory of Skanderbeg's resistance, of Balkan heroism, of a world before the Ottoman conquest, in forms that could be transmitted without writing, without institutions, without anything that the state could confiscate or burn. The language itself is the most remarkable piece of evidence for this persistence. Albanian is an Indo-European language with no close living relatives. It forms its own branch of the Indo-European family, a branch so ancient and so distinct that linguists who study it encounter vocabulary items without cognates in any other living language, fossil words from a linguistic stage so ancient that its nearest parallels are in the Proto-Indo-European reconstruction that scholars have assembled from scattered evidence across dozens of languages. The Albanian words for common farm animals, the horse, the cow, the sheep, are among the most archaic forms in the Indo-European family. The numerals bear traces of phonological shifts that happened so early in the evolution of Albanian that they place the language's divergence from other Indo-European languages in a period almost unimaginably remote. This means that Albanian is old, very old, and it means that the people who speak it have been speaking a version of it, in this corner of the Balkans, for an extremely long time. Not uninterrupted. Languages change, borrow, merge, and split, but in recognizable continuity, without ever being replaced or displaced by the Latin of the Romans, the Greek of the Byzantines, the Slavic of the medieval migrations, the Turkish of the Ottomans. Surrounded by languages vastly more powerful in terms of administrative and cultural prestige, Albanian stubbornly continued to exist as the primary medium of domestic and intimate life for its speakers across century after century. The Albanian language survived, remarkably, but it was not a language of administration or education or literature in this period. Albanian was a spoken language, a household language, a language of the mountains and the village. Written literary production in Albanian remained extremely limited until the 19th century. The famous phrase that describes this situation, "Albanians have 5 languages and no literature," overstates the case somewhat but captures a real phenomenon. Albanian identity in the Ottoman period was embodied more in oral tradition, in customary law, in music and folk epic, than in written culture. The earliest significant text in Albanian dates from 1462, a baptismal formula written by the Archbishop of Durrës, Palangeli, probably as a practical aid for priests who needed to administer the sacrament to Albanian-speaking populations who did not understand Latin. Unt pagus unt premeditati biri spiritit senate, I baptize you in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. 27 words, written in a Latin-inflected orthography, preserved in a single manuscript in Bologna. It is the earliest known written record of the Albanian language, and it is quietly extraordinary, a language that had been spoken for millennia, finally captured in writing by a bishop who needed it for pastoral purposes rather than cultural ones. Scattered other texts followed over the centuries, religious texts, mainly, produced by Catholic priests in northern Albania and by Orthodox clergy in the south, serving Albanian-speaking communities who needed religious instruction in their own language. The Meshari, the Missal of John Buzuku, published in 1555, is the first substantial book in Albanian. Its author was almost certainly a Catholic priest of northern Albanian origin, and his work, a liturgical handbook with prayers, catechisms, and biblical readings, is a remarkable achievement given the complete absence of any established tradition of written Albanian at the time. Buzuku had to invent much of his orthography as he went, working without predecessors, without established conventions, without the linguistic infrastructure that European vernacular literatures could draw on. The result is imperfect but extraordinary. These early texts were almost entirely religious in nature, produced for functional liturgical purposes rather than literary ambition. But they document something important. Throughout the Ottoman period, in the margins of imperial culture, Albanian-speaking communities maintained enough religious and communal life to generate the need for written Albanian, and enough individual initiative to meet that need. The real literary flowering had to wait for the 19th century. The Highland Canon, specifically the Canon of Leke Dukajini, attributed to a 15th-century Albanian lord but probably representing the codification of much older traditions, governed social life in the Northern Highlands with a comprehensiveness that covered everything from property disputes to marriage arrangements to the obligations of hospitality to the terrifying institution of blood feud. The Ottoman state coexisted uneasily with the canon in the Highland districts, never quite managing to replace it and sometimes finding it strategically convenient to allow it to function as a form of local governance. The Highland clans of northern Albania, the Gashi, the Hoti, the Berisha, the Kelmendi, the Shkreli, and many others, maintained forms of armed independence well into the 19th and even 20th century that would have been unrecognizable in most of Ottoman Europe. They paid nominal taxes when they felt like it. They resisted conscription. They feuded with each other according to their own rules. They were fierce, proud, and extraordinarily hard to govern by any external power. The Ottomans, the Austro-Hungarians, the Yugoslav communists, and even the Albanian communist state itself would all struggle with the same fundamental problem. The Northern Highlands operated by their own logic, and that logic did not easily bend to the demands of centralized authority. But while the mountains maintained their fierce independence, the lowlands and coastal cities were gradually integrated into the broader Ottoman economy and administrative system. Towns like Gjirokastër, Berat, Kors, and Shkodër developed into significant regional centers with their own merchant classes, artisan guilds, and cultural institutions. Berat, the city of 1,000 windows, its white Ottoman houses climbing up the hillside above the Osum River, became one of the most beautiful examples of Balkan urban architecture in the Ottoman world. Gjirokastër, in the deep south, with its distinctive grey stone houses and its massive castle dominating the valley, became the capital of a regional economy that connected southern Albania to the wider Adriatic and Greek trading networks. This was the Albania that existed as the 19th century turned and the Ottoman Empire entered its long terminal crisis, a complex, internally diverse, religiously heterogeneous, linguistically unified but politically fragmented society, partially integrated into Ottoman structures and partially resistant to them, producing both loyal Ottoman servants and fierce Highland rebels, simultaneously part of the empire and somehow always slightly apart from it. The 19th century changed everything. Across the Balkans, the great age of nationalist awakening was transforming Ottoman subjects into Greeks, Serbs, Romanians, Bulgarians, peoples with national histories and national claims and national armies. The Greek War of Independence erupted in 1821 and culminated in the establishment of an independent Greek state in 1832. Serbia had won autonomous status within the empire by 1817. Romanian principalities were moving toward unification. Bulgaria was stirring. Every people with a distinct language and a historical grievance was discovering, or inventing, or reimagining its national identity through the lens of the romantic nationalism that was sweeping the Western world. The Albanian national awakening, the Rilinja, the Renaissance, arrived later than many of its Balkan neighbors, partly because of the complications of religious diversity. How do you build national identity across Muslim, Catholic, and Orthodox communities, and partly because the Albanian professional and educated class was so thoroughly embedded in Ottoman institutions that outright separatism was harder to contemplate. Albanian officers served in the Ottoman army. Albanian intellectuals worked in Ottoman bureaucracies. The Albanian language had no standardized alphabet and almost no printed literature. But the Rilinja, when it came, was a movement of extraordinary cultural energy. The poets and writers and educators who constituted the Albanian national awakening were working against almost impossible odds. They had no established publishing tradition in Albanian, no schools where Albanian was taught, no cultural institutions that could serve as bases for their activity. Many of them worked from exile, from the Albanian diaspora communities scattered across Istanbul, Bucharest, Sofia, Cairo, and the cities of the United States where Albanian immigrants had established themselves. Naim Frashëri is the central figure of this literary renaissance. The man who did for Albanian what Dante had done for Italian or Pushkin for Russian, who took a language that existed primarily in peasant speech and folk epic and elevated it into a medium for serious poetry, for philosophical meditation, for national yearning. Born in 1846 in the village of Frashëri in southern Albania, from the Bektashi Muslim tradition, educated in Greek schools because no Albanian schools existed, Naim worked in the Ottoman bureaucracy in Istanbul while writing in Albanian with fierce determination. His pastoral poem, Bëgjidi Qija Flocks and Tillage, published in 1886, is one of the founding texts of Albanian literature, a celebration of the Albanian countryside, its mountains and rivers and shepherds and villages, rendered in a language of such fresh and unaffected beauty that it serves simultaneously as poetry and as national manifesto. His brother Sami Frashëri was the theorist of the movement, the man who articulated what Albanian nationhood meant in the clearest and most systematic terms. His pamphlet Albania, What It Was, What It Is, and What It Will Become, published in 1899, is one of the great documents of Balkan nationalist thought, an argument for Albanian national identity that crossed religious lines by placing ethnicity and language above faith, insisting that what made a person Albanian was not whether they prayed in a mosque or a church but whether they spoke Albanian and identified with the Albanian people. This was a genuinely radical idea in a region where religious identity and ethnic identity had been so intertwined for so long that separating them seemed almost unimaginable. The Ottoman millet system had organized communities by religion, not by ethnicity. The Greek Orthodox Patriarchate in Constantinople had for centuries claimed authority over Orthodox Christians regardless of their language, which meant that Orthodox Albanians in the south were often pushed toward Greek cultural identity by the institutional pressure of the Church. The Catholic Albanians of the north had closer connections to Rome and to the Italian world. The Muslim majority was navigating its relationship to the Ottoman state. Sami Frashëri's insistence that these religious differences were secondary to the shared identity of Albanian language and culture was not immediately accepted by everyone. It has not been entirely accepted even today. And the question of what being Albanian means for religiously diverse communities remains one of the most interesting and contested questions in contemporary Albanian culture. But as a political strategy for building a national movement, it was brilliant, because it was the only strategy that could work given Albania's demographics. The movement needed a home base, and it found one, or rather, it built one, in the diaspora. The Albanian communities of Romania, Bulgaria, Egypt, and especially the United States became centers of Albanian cultural and political activism. The Albanian American community, established primarily in Boston and New York and other northeastern cities by immigrants who had left in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, supported Albanian language newspapers, funded cultural organizations, raised money for Albanian schools, and provided political pressure that would eventually influence American policy toward Albania during the critical years of 1912 to 1913. The newspaper The Nation, published in Boston starting in 1906, was one of the voices of this diaspora activism. Fan Nali, who would eventually become the most prominent Albanian American political figure of his generation, was involved in its publication. The Albanian Orthodox Autocephalous Church, which Albanian Americans established in 1908 to free themselves from the influence of the Greek Patriarchate, was another institution of the diaspora that simultaneously served religious and national purposes. The Congress of Monastir in 1908, which standardized the Albanian alphabet, was itself partly a product of diaspora intellectual work. The debates about which script to use, Latin versus Arabic versus a modified Greek alphabet, were not merely technical. They were political statements about the direction of Albanian civilization. The choice of the Latin alphabet aligned Albania culturally with Europe and with the literate traditions of Catholic northern Albania. It implicitly rejected Ottoman and Islamic cultural dominance. It pointed toward a future in which Albanian identity was European rather than Oriental, and in doing so, it made a statement about what kind of country an independent Albania would be. The Balkan Wars of 1912 to 1913 compressed the question of Albanian independence from a theoretical aspiration into an urgent practical necessity. When the Ottoman Empire collapsed in Europe with stunning speed in the autumn of 1912, when Serbia, Montenegro, Bulgaria, and Greece swept across Ottoman territory in weeks, Albania had perhaps a few months to establish itself as a political entity before the victorious Balkan states carved up its territory among themselves. Ismail Kamali, the man who proclaimed independence in Vlora on November 28, 1912, understood this with absolute clarity. He was 67 years old, had spent decades in Ottoman service and in political exile, had negotiated in the great capitals of Europe and the Ottoman court, and he had perhaps a clearer view of the international landscape than almost anyone else in the Albanian political world. He knew that Albania's only chance of survival as an entity was to present the great powers with a fait accompli, a government, a declaration, a flag, before the partition of Albanian territory could be completed. The flag he raised over Vlora that November day was Skanderbeg's flag, the double-headed eagle on red resurrected from 400 years of absence, reclaimed as the symbol of a new state that was also, implicitly, the continuation of an ancient resistance. The symbolism was deliberate and powerful. We were here before the Ottomans came. We are still here. This is still our land, but declaring independence and actually having a functioning state were entirely different things, as the years immediately following would demonstrate with cruel clarity. The new Albania had no army, no tax system, no courts, no established civil service. It had rival factions competing for influence, the traditional landed aristocracy, the clan leaders of the north, the religious establishments of all three communities, the professional class that had emerged from Ottoman service, the small but vocal contingent of Western-educated reformers. It had great power representatives who had been assigned to oversee the new state and who understood it poorly if at all. The great powers appointed a neutral international commission to determine Albania's borders and a neutral sovereign to rule it, the unfortunate Wilhelm of Wied, whose 6 months in Albania from March to September 1914 constitute one of the more genuinely bizarre episodes in 20th-century European political history. He arrived to find a country in which his authority was contested from day one. In the north, the Highland clans acknowledged him not at all. In the south, a Greek-backed movement called the Autonomous Republic of Northern Epirus was seeking to detach the southern regions with Greek-majority populations. In central Albania, an insurgency inspired partly by religious sentiment and partly by genuine political grievance threatened the fledgling government in Tirana. Wilhelm of Wied lacked the military force, the financial resources, the political skill, and frankly the temperament to navigate any of these challenges. When the First World War broke out in August 1914, it provided him with a convenient excuse to leave, which he did promptly, never to return. What followed, the 6 years from 1914 to 1920, was the most chaotic and destructive period in modern Albanian history before the 1990s. Foreign armies crossed and recrossed Albanian territory. The Serbian army's retreat through Albania in the winter of 1915 to 1916 was one of the most devastating episodes of the entire war. 150,000 Serbian soldiers and uncounted civilians, retreating before the combined Austro-Hungarian, German, and Bulgarian advance, moving through Albanian mountain passes in winter conditions so brutal that tens of thousands died of cold, hunger, and disease before they could be evacuated by Allied ships from the Albanian coast. The Albanian highland communities through which this catastrophic column passed experienced both enormous hardship, their food and resources stripped by the retreating army, and quiet acts of extraordinary humanity, with Albanian families offering shelter and food to Serbian soldiers and civilians despite having almost nothing themselves. The occupation years left Albania's already fragile social fabric in tatters. Different zones of the country were occupied by different powers at different times: the Austro-Hungarians in the north, the Italians in the center and south, the French in the southeast near Korçë, the Greeks in the far south. Each occupying power pursued its own interests with complete disregard for Albanian sovereignty. The Italian occupation was particularly significant because Italy had territorial ambitions. The Treaty of London of 1915 had promised Italy the port of Vlora and a protectorate over central Albania in exchange for joining the Entente, and the Italian presence in Vlora was specifically aimed at establishing a permanent foothold on the eastern Adriatic coast. The Albanians who drove the Italians out of Vlora in the summer of 1920 were not a professional army. They were a combination of irregular fighters, former Ottoman soldiers, clan militias, and ordinary citizens who had reached the absolute limit of their patience with foreign occupation. The battle was fierce and costly, But the Italians, calculating that the cost of maintaining their Albanian position was exceeding its strategic value, withdrew. The victory was celebrated as Albania's first successful assertion of the military sovereignty that the 1912 declaration had theoretically established but never practically achieved. It was this victory, combined with Woodrow Wilson's championship of Albanian rights at Paris, that secured Albania's place in the League of Nations in 1920. Membership in the League was not merely symbolic. It provided a framework of international recognition and, more importantly, a mechanism through which Albania could appeal to international opinion against the territorial ambitions of its neighbors. It was far from perfect protection. The League's enforcement mechanisms were weak, and the great powers continued to pursue their own interests in the Albanian region regardless of Albanian preferences, but it was something. It was evidence that Albania existed as a recognized international entity, and that existence, however precarious, gave Albanian politics a stage on which to operate. What changed was a combination of external pressure and internal resolve. The external pressure came from the decisions of the great powers. Following the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878 and the subsequent Congress of Berlin, that famous gathering of European diplomats who redrew the map of the Balkans with breathtaking nonchalance about the people actually living in the territories they were reassigning, Albania faced an existential crisis. The Treaty of Berlin assigned Albanian inhabited territories to Serbia, Montenegro, and Greece. Large populations of Albanian speakers were to be handed to states whose languages they did not speak and whose governments had shown no particular affection for them. The response was the League of Prizren, formed in June 1878 in the city of Prizren, now in Kosovo, by Albanian leaders from across the Balkan regions inhabited by Albanian speakers. The League was a remarkable political achievement, a coalition crossing religious lines. Muslim, Catholic, and Orthodox Albanians participated, regional lines, northern and southern, highland and lowland, and class lines, nobles, merchants, and religious leaders all involved. Its demands were fundamentally defensive. Albanian inhabited territory should not be partitioned and assigned to neighboring states. The League did not initially call for full independence from the Ottoman Empire. It called for a unified Albanian vilayet, a single Ottoman administrative province encompassing the Albanian lands, that would give the Albanian community a political structure to defend its territorial integrity. The Ottomans, alarmed by the League's growing military power and political ambitions, eventually moved to suppress it. By 1881, Ottoman troops had dispersed the League's forces and arrested many of its leaders. But the political consciousness it had awakened could not be similarly suppressed. The Relinja, the Albanian National Renaissance, continued its work in the cultural realm even as political organization remained difficult. Albanian intellectuals in the diaspora, in Constantinople, in Italy, in the United States, in Romania, in Egypt, began producing Albanian language books and newspapers, debating the creation of a standardized Albanian alphabet, writing poetry and history and philosophy in the language that had previously existed only in oral form. The resolution of the alphabet question was itself a political act of considerable significance. Albanian had been written in various scripts throughout its history. Greek, Latin, and Arabic scripts were all used by different communities at different times. At the Congress of Monastir in 1908, a gathering of Albanian intellectuals in the city now known as Bitolia, in North Macedonia, a standardized Latin-based alphabet for Albanian was agreed upon. Latin letters, not Arabic, not Greek. The choice was deliberate, signaling an orientation toward Europe rather than toward the Ottoman East, a statement about the kind of modern nation the Albanian national movement envisioned. The final unraveling of Ottoman power in Europe came through the Balkan Wars of 1912 to 1913. In October 1912, a coalition of Serbia, Bulgaria, Montenegro, and Greece launched a coordinated military attack on the Ottoman Empire that within weeks had stripped the port of virtually all its remaining European territory. The speed of the Ottoman collapse was breathtaking. Centuries of imperial presence in the Balkans erased in a matter of months by smaller states fighting with modern weapons and modern nationalist motivation. For Albania, this created both an opportunity and a catastrophe. The opportunity was independence, or something like it. On November 28, 1912, in the coastal city of Vlora, a gathering of Albanian delegates signed a declaration of independence and established a provisional government under Ismail Kamali, a veteran Albanian politician who had spent years navigating Ottoman bureaucracy while simultaneously working for Albanian autonomy. The double-headed eagle flag flew over Vlora. Albania declared itself a state. The catastrophe was that nobody agreed on what Albania was. The neighboring states that had just defeated the Ottomans, Serbia, Montenegro, Greece, had their own ideas about which territories with Albanian populations rightfully belonged to them, and those ideas generally didn't involve leaving very much for Albania. The great powers, Austria-Hungary, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Russia were convened in London to settle the Balkans question, and they approached it with the same combination of strategic calculation and casual indifference to Albanian aspirations that had characterized European diplomacy toward Albania throughout the 19th century. The result of the 1913 London Conference was an independent Albanian state, which was something but a state whose borders left hundreds of thousands of Albanian speakers outside its territory. Kosovo, with its large Albanian majority, was assigned to Serbia. The Kamiria region in the south, heavily Albanian, was assigned to Greece. The territories assigned to Montenegro and Serbia in the northwest removed other Albanian communities from the new state. The borders drawn in 1913 cut the Albanian ethnic territory roughly in half. This was a wound that would never fully heal. Kosovo, Kosova in Albanian, the cradle of Albanian historical memory, home to the Field of Blackbirds where the medieval Serbian-Albanian alliance had fought the Ottomans in 1389. Home to Prizren where the League had met in 1878, home to Pristina and Peja and Jakova and Jan. Kosovo would be a source of unresolved tension between Albanians and Serbs for the entire 20th century and into the 21st, but first, the new state of Albania had to survive. And that was far from certain. The Albania that emerged from 1912 to 1913 was not a state in any functioning sense. It was a declaration, an idea, a set of borders on a map. It had no working government, no army, no civil service, no national currency, no reliable infrastructure. It had rival factions competing for power. It had regions where local strongmen, traditional clan leaders, exercised more real authority than any Tirana-based government. It had great power-appointed representatives who had little knowledge of Albanian conditions and even less genuine interest in Albanian well-being. The great powers attempted to stabilize the new state by appointing a foreign prince, Wilhelm of Wied, a German army officer with no Albanian connections, no knowledge of Albanian language or culture, and no particular enthusiasm for the position as sovereign of Albania in 1914. He arrived in March. He left in September of the same year. The First World War had broken out, and with it, any pretense of great power engagement with the Albanian question dissolved. Wilhelm of Wied returned to Germany. Albania dissolved into chaos. The years of the First World War were among the most catastrophic in Albanian history. With no functioning central government and with its territory of strategic interest to multiple combatants, Albania became a battlefield for foreign armies that treated its population as an irrelevance. Serbian forces retreated through Albania in the devastating winter of 1915 to 1916, pursued by Austro-Hungarian and Bulgarian armies, a retreat so brutal that it claimed tens of thousands of Serbian lives and left a trail of destruction across the Albanian highlands. Austrian, Italian, French, and Greek forces all occupied portions of Albanian territory at various points during the war, each pursuing its own strategic objectives with complete indifference to Albanian sovereignty. The Paris Peace Conference of 1919 raised Albanian fears of partition to a new peak. Italy had been promised Albanian territories in the secret Treaty of London of 1915 as inducement to join the Entente, and it showed up in Paris prepared to collect. Greece claimed the southern Albanian region it called Northern Epirus. Serbia had its own territorial ambitions. For a terrifying period in 1919 to 1920, it looked as though Albania might be simply divided among its neighbors and erased from the map entirely. What saved it was a combination of Albanian armed resistance, particularly the uprising of 1920 that forced Italian troops out of the city of Vlora in a battle that remains a celebrated moment in Albanian national memory, and the intervention of Woodrow Wilson's idealistic American delegation, which opposed the dismemberment of small nations. Albania was admitted to the League of Nations in 1920, which gave it international recognition and a degree of protection from the territorial ambitions of its neighbors, but recognition and survival were not the same as stability. The Albania of the early 1920s was a state in the most fragile possible sense, a government in Tirana that exercised nominal authority over a territory where effective power was still largely local, where bandits and clan leaders and foreign spies competed freely, where the economy was essentially pre-capitalist, where literacy rates were among the lowest in Europe, and where the political class was divided between modernizers who wanted to build a Western-style nation-state and conservatives who wanted to preserve traditional structures. Into this chaos stepped two men who would define the limits of Albanian political possibility in the 20th century. The first was Fan Nali. The second was Ahmet Zogu. Fan Nali was one of the most extraordinary figures in Albanian intellectual and political history, a bishop of the Albanian Orthodox Church, a Harvard-educated intellectual, a translator of Shakespeare and Cervantes and Omar Khayyam into Albanian, a composer of liturgical music, a political radical who had been involved in Albanian immigrant political activism in the United States before returning to his homeland. He was brilliant, idealistic, and fatally impractical. In June 1924, following a political crisis and the assassination of a prominent reformist politician. Nali led what became known as the Democratic Revolution, a coalition of progressives and political outsiders that briefly took control of the Albanian government. He became prime minister. His program was ambitious to the point of impossibility given Albanian conditions: land reform, modernization of the legal system, diplomatic recognition including from the Soviet Union, reduction of the power of traditional clan leaders and feudal landowners. He was genuinely trying to build a modern state in an extraordinarily unfavorable environment. He lasted 6 months. The man who displaced him was Ahmet Bej Zogu, a young northern Albanian tribal chief's son who had navigated the chaos of Albanian politics with far more ruthlessness than idealism. Zogu was not an intellectual. He was not a Democrat. He was a survivor, a political operator who had been government minister, prime minister, and, when that seemed insufficient, launched a coup with Yugoslav military backing that put Nali's government to flight in December 1924 and installed himself as the dominant power in Albania. Fan Nali fled to Italy and then to the United States, where he spent the rest of his long life in exile, translating literature, leading the Albanian Orthodox Church in America, writing, and thinking about the country he had failed to transform. Zogu had no such philosophical consolations. He had one, and he proceeded to consolidate power with the methodical thoroughness of someone who had seen enough Albanian instability to understand that his own survival depended on eliminating alternatives. He became prime minister, then president. Then, in 1928, in a move that carried echoes of Albanian historical tradition, the medieval princes, the Ottoman pashas, he declared himself King Zog I, King of the Albanians. King Zog's reign from 1928 to 1939 was one of the strangest political experiments in 20th century European history. He was an authoritarian modernizer, which is a contradiction that only makes sense in the specific context of a pre-modern society being dragged by force toward the 20th century. He banned the veil. He encouraged European dress and education. He built roads and schools. He established a Western-style legal system. He brought in foreign advisors, Italian administrators and military trainers initially, and this would prove his greatest strategic error. He also executed opponents, suppressed press freedom, banned political parties, survived multiple assassination attempts. He was reputedly the only head of state in Europe to have personally shot back at his assassins in the lobby of the Vienna Opera House, and ran his country as a personal fiefdom held together by a combination of tribal loyalties, Italian financial support, and the knowledge that he had no credible challenger. The Italian connection was the fatal one. Mussolini's Italy saw Albania as the gateway to its eastern Mediterranean ambitions, an Adriatic bridgehead through which Italian power could project into Yugoslavia and Greece. Throughout the 1930s, Italian economic penetration of Albania deepened, Italian military advisors multiplied, Italian businesses monopolized key sectors of the Albanian economy. Zog was trapped in a dependency he had no real means of escaping. He tried to play off Italian interests against Yugoslav and British interests. He married a Hungarian countess in an elaborate European-style royal wedding. He had a son. He tried to project the image of a modern European monarchy. On Good Friday, April 7, 1939, Italian troops crossed the Adriatic and invaded Albania. The Albanian army offered brief, scattered resistance. Zog fled, first to Greece, then to France, then through the wartime maze of European exile to Britain and eventually Egypt. He never returned. He died in France in 1961. His son Lika, who had been born just 2 days before the Italian invasion, spent most of his life in exile and returned to Albania briefly in the 1990s to discover that his attempts to claim the throne found little support in a country that had experienced rather a lot of kings and rulers and was in no mood to experience another. The Italian occupation from 1939 to 1943 brought Albania into the fascist empire's orbit, united with Italy in a personal union that was essentially annexation by another name. The Italians pursued economic development projects in Albania, but also pursued their war aims, using Albanian territory as a launching pad for the disastrous Greek campaign of 1940 that began with such confidence and ended with Italian forces being hurled back into Albania by unexpectedly fierce Greek counterattacks. German forces had to rescue the Italian position in the Balkans in 1941, and after that, Albanian territory was occupied by both Italian and German forces simultaneously, creating a complex occupying authority that Albanians would spend the entire war trying to navigate, resist, collaborate with, or simply survive. The Albanian resistance to Axis occupation produced two competing movements that mirrored the broader European pattern of wartime resistance politics. The Bali Kombëtar, the National Front, was a nationalist resistance organization with conservative roots, generally opposed to both communism and the restoration of monarchy, rooted in the same educated middle class and landowning families that had shaped Albanian politics in the interwar years. The Bali Kombëtar's vision of Albania was nationalist and, at least in theory, democratic, a free Albania, but not a communist one. Its leadership included some of the most prominent Albanian intellectual and political figures of the era. The communist partisans were a very different formation. The Albanian Communist Party had been founded only in November 1941, organized under the direct guidance of Yugoslav communist emissaries, specifically Miladin Popović and Dusan Mugosa, sent by Tito's Yugoslav partisans to help organize the Albanian communists, a fact that would later become a source of enormous political tension when the relationship between Albania and Yugoslavia soured after the war. The party's founder and undisputed leader from the beginning was Enver Hoxha, the schoolteacher from Gjirokastër who had spent time in France, had been quietly organizing left-wing intellectual circles in Korçë, and who displayed from the very beginning the qualities that would define his four-decade rule: organizational ruthlessness, absolute intolerance of internal dissent, and a capacity for ideological argument that was matched by an equally powerful capacity for eliminating those who argued back. The war years in Albania were years of extraordinary violence, complexity, and moral ambiguity. The Italian occupation from 1939 to 1943 was relatively mild by the standards of Axis occupations. The Italians were not conducting the kind of systematic atrocities against Albanian civilians that the Germans were inflicting in Poland, in Russia, in Serbia. They were building roads, schools, and infrastructure, pursuing what they called a civilizing mission with the particular combination of arrogance and genuine investment that characterized Italian colonial practice. Some Albanians collaborated with the Italian administration not out of enthusiasm for fascism but out of pragmatic calculation that the Italians were there, that they were providing employment and stability, and that resistance would cost more than it would gain. Other Albanians resisted from the beginning. The partisan movements organized in the mountains, striking Italian military convoys and communication lines, gathering weapons and recruits, building the organizational structure that would eventually contest for national power. The resistance was dangerous work. Italian reprisals against suspected partisan supporters were harsh, involving executions, village burnings, and collective punishment. The Albanian resistance fighters who survived the Italian occupation years were men and women of extraordinary toughness and commitment. The German occupation, which replaced the Italian after Italy's armistice with the Allies in September 1943, was qualitatively different in its brutality. The Germans had no pretense of civilizing mission. They were extracting military value from Albania. They needed the coastal positions, the lines of communication, the Albanian collaboration in maintaining order, and they were willing to kill with a directness that the Italians had largely avoided. German reprisals against suspected resistance supporters were more systematic and more lethal. And the German period also brought a new horror: the systematic persecution and deportation of Albanian Jews. Albania's Jewish community was small, perhaps 2,000 people before the war, concentrated in the cities. But Albania's record in relation to its Jewish population during the Holocaust is one of the most remarkable in all of occupied Europe. While across most of Nazi-occupied territory Jews were being rounded up and deported to death camps, Albanian Jews were almost universally protected, hidden by Albanian families, provided with false documents, sheltered in mountain villages where the Nazi reach was weakest. Not a single Albanian Jew was deported. Not one Albanian Jew perished in the Nazi genocide. And beyond the protection of local Jews, Albania took in Jewish refugees from elsewhere in the Balkans, extending the same protection to people who were not Albanian citizens. This extraordinary record has been explained in various ways. Some scholars emphasize the Besa, the Albanian concept of sacred hospitality and inviolable promise, rooted in the canon, that once you have given shelter to a guest or a person in need, their safety becomes your honor obligation absolutely. Others point to the relatively low level of anti-Semitism in Albanian culture, where Jews had lived quietly for centuries without being the focus of particular hostility. Others note the pragmatic resistance of Albanian families who were simply determined not to collaborate with the German occupiers in this most extreme form of collaboration. Whatever the combination of factors, the result was that Yad Vashem has recognized more Albanian righteous among the nations per capita than almost any other European country, people who risked their own lives to save Jewish lives, who embodied in their individual actions something that can only be called moral greatness. The two resistance movements, the communist partisans and the Bali Kombëtar, not only fought the occupiers, they fought each other. This was not unique to Albania. Similar fratricidal conflicts between communist and non-communist resistance movements occurred in Greece and Yugoslavia and elsewhere. But in Albania, the bitterness of this internal conflict was particularly intense. partly because the ideological distance between the two movements was very great, and partly because the communists were absolutely determined not merely to defeat the fascist occupier but to eliminate any political force that might compete with them for power after the occupation ended. This determination manifested in a kind of cold strategic calculation that distinguished the Albanian communists from many other resistance movements. While the stated goal was always fighting the fascists, the practical effect of communist military policy was often to weaken the Balkan at least as much as the Germans. Meetings between the two movements to coordinate resistance ended in mutual accusations and sometimes in violence. By late 1943 and into 1944, the civil conflict between communist partisans and nationalist forces was consuming as much Albanian blood as the fight against the occupiers. The British SOE, the Special Operations Executive, which was running agents across occupied Europe to support resistance movements, made a fateful calculation in this period. Evaluating the military effectiveness of the two movements, British agents in Albania concluded that the communist partisans were fighting the Germans more actively and with greater effect than the Balkan. The Balkan, by contrast, was increasingly making local accommodations with German forces in some areas, calculating that this was preferable to the communist alternative. The British response was to swing their support, their weapons drops, their liaison officers, their strategic communication to the communists. It was a decision with consequences that extended far beyond the end of the war. British weapons and British support helped the Albanian communist movement build a military superiority over its rivals that translated directly into political dominance when the Germans withdrew. But the British decision was also, from their immediate strategic perspective, not unreasonable. They needed people who were actually fighting the Germans, and by the metrics available to them, the communists were doing more of that. When German forces withdrew from Albania in late October and November 1944, a withdrawal that was part of the larger German retreat from the Balkans as Soviet forces closed in from the east, they left behind a country that had been under occupation for 5 years, had experienced bitter internal conflict between resistance movements, had seen its urban economy disrupted and its rural population subjected to repeated military violence, and was now controlled, almost completely, by a triumphant communist movement under Enver Hoxha, who had emerged from the war as both political leader and commander-in-chief of the National Liberation Army. The speed with which Hoxha consolidated power in the immediate post-war period was breathtaking. Within months of liberation, the political space in Albania had contracted from the complex multi-faction landscape of the resistance years to a single permissible political tendency, the Communist Party of Labour of Albania, as the Communist Party renamed itself. The Balkan leadership was killed, imprisoned, or driven into exile. Former members of Zog's royal government who had remained in Albania faced show trials and execution. Catholic clergy, who had maintained the closest connections of any Albanian religious group to the Vatican and to Italy and who were seen as potentially conduits for foreign anti-communist influence, were subjected to particular persecution. Priests were arrested, monasteries closed, and several clergymen were executed. Orthodox and Muslim religious leaders who attempted to maintain independent positions were similarly dealt with. The trial and execution of Kosi Zox in 1949 was the first major purge within the party itself, and it established the pattern that would repeat throughout Hoxha's rule. Zox had been the Albanian communist most closely associated with Yugoslavia. He had maintained the connections to Tito's party that dated from the war years. And when the Tito-Stalin split of 1948 made Yugoslavia the enemy of the communist bloc, Zox's Yugoslav associations became his death warrant. He was accused of being a Titoist agent, a traitor who had planned to subordinate Albania to Yugoslav dominance. He was tried, found guilty, and executed. Whether the charges were entirely fabricated or contained some grain of truth is almost irrelevant. What mattered was that in Hoxha's Albania, the accusation was sufficient, and the process of accusation and elimination had been inaugurated. The break with Yugoslavia in 1948 pushed Albania into the arms of the Soviet Union, and the years of Soviet alignment, roughly 1948 to 1961, brought both benefits and costs. Soviet economic and technical aid helped Albania build its industrial base, the first electric power plants, the first modern factories, the first proper railroad. Soviet advisors helped reorganize the Albanian military and security services on the Soviet model. The Soviet alliance gave Hoxha's regime an international patron and protector, reducing Albania's isolation and providing a framework of legitimacy. But Hoxha was never comfortable with dependence on any external power, and the Soviet alliance was also, from his perspective, a compromise with his absolute sovereign independence. When Nikita Khrushchev began his program of de-Stalinization after 1956, when he denounced Stalin's crimes in the famous secret speech to the 20th Party Congress, when he began pursuing peaceful coexistence with the Western powers rather than the confrontational militancy of the Stalin years, Hoxha saw existential threat. Stalin had been Hoxha's model, the ultimate communist patriarch, the man who had built socialism in one country through iron will and the elimination of every conceivable form of opposition. To denounce Stalin was, in Hoxha's view, to denounce the entire method of building communism that he himself had applied in Albania, and to pursue peaceful coexistence with the West was to abandon the revolutionary struggle that gave communism its meaning and its purpose. The split with Moscow that Hoxha engineered between 1960 and 1961 was one of the most audacious acts of independent judgment by a small state leader in Cold War history. Albania, a tiny, poor, underdeveloped country of 2 million people on the periphery of Europe, publicly broke with the Soviet Union, the global superpower and patron of the communist world, because its leader judged that the Soviet Union was no longer practicing real communism. This was remarkable not just for its intellectual audacity but for its practical recklessness. The Soviets withdrew their advisors, their aid, and their military support almost overnight, leaving Albania dangerously exposed. The Chinese alternative that Hoxha immediately embraced, Mao Zedong's China, which was itself in the process of breaking with Moscow over similar ideological disputes, provided a new patron and a new source of aid. Chinese technicians replaced Soviet advisors. Chinese economic assistance replaced Soviet loans. And Chinese Maoist ideology, with its emphasis on revolutionary militancy, its cultural revolution model of purging bourgeois influence from society, and its confrontational posture toward both the Western capitalist world and the Soviet social imperialist revision of genuine Marxism, gave Hoxha's regime a new ideological framework that he embraced with genuine enthusiasm. The period of Chinese alignment, from roughly 1961 to 1978, was the height of Albanian communism in terms of ideological fervor. The Cultural Revolution model inspired Hoxha's own campaigns, the 1966 to 1969 Albanian Cultural Revolution that targeted religion, traditional customs, and what the party called bourgeois remnants in Albanian society was explicitly modeled on what was happening simultaneously in China, with the same combination of ideological mobilization, youth activism, and ruthless attack on established institutions. Religious sites were closed or destroyed. Religious practice was criminalized. Intellectuals were sent to work in mines and fields. The entire society was mobilized in what the party presented as a permanent revolutionary struggle against internal and external enemies. The bunker program began in this period. The decision to fortify every corner of Albanian territory with concrete defensive structures was made by Hoxha in the late 1960s, and the construction continued with grim persistence through the 1970s and into the 1980s. The chief military figure associated with the bunker program was Mehmet Shehu, Hoxha's second-in-command, commander of the partisan forces during the war, a man of extraordinary physical courage and political ruthlessness who had been the number 2 in the Albanian system since liberation. Shehu was responsible for Albania's defense policy, and the bunker program reflected his and Hoxha's shared conviction that Albania faced existential military threat from multiple directions simultaneously. Every ridge line that might offer a defensive firing position, every beach where troops might land, every road junction that might need to be defended, all of these required a bunker. The specifications were developed by Albanian military engineers and the production was carried out by Albanian factories and Albanian labor, often workers fulfilling their military service obligation. The concrete was poured by the millions of tons. The firing slits were cast to precise dimensions. The mushroom-shaped domes, technically called kepenk in Albanian, meaning something like dome cap, were designed to be resistant to direct fire from standard infantry weapons while providing a protected firing position for 1 to 4 defenders. The bunker program consumed an estimated $3 to $4 billion at contemporary prices, an enormous sum for one of the poorest economies in Europe. To put it in perspective, Albania was building more concrete fortifications per square kilometer than any country in the world, including countries that were actively at war, while simultaneously experiencing some of the lowest living standards in the entire European continent. The average Albanian family in the 1970s and 1980s had access to limited food varieties, primitive medical care by Western standards, almost no consumer goods, and no capacity to travel or communicate with the outside world. But they were very well defended against the invasion that was never coming. Mehmet Shehu died in December 1981. The official announcement said he had committed suicide. Almost nobody believed it. The circumstances were too convenient, the timing too suspicious, the political context too charged. What had happened, in the most plausible reconstruction based on evidence that only became available after the regime's end, was that Hoxha had turned on Shehu, his closest collaborator for 40 years, in the grip of a paranoia that had by this point consumed every capacity for rational political judgment. Shehu was posthumously accused of being an agent simultaneously of the CIA, the KGB, and the Yugoslav UDB, 3 mutually hostile intelligence agencies whose combined penetration of the Albanian government. If the accusations were to be believed, would have made the administration of Albania essentially impossible for decades. The logic collapsed under the slightest scrutiny. But in Hoxha's Albania, scrutiny of official accusations was itself a dangerous activity. The purge of Shehu set off a wave of secondary purges as everyone who had been associated with him, family members, colleagues, subordinates, friends, was subjected to investigation, arrest, and in many cases imprisonment or execution. Shehu's wife was imprisoned. His sons were arrested. His associates in the military and security services were removed. The ripple effects spread outward through Albanian society for years, trapping people whose only crime was a connection to a man who had served the regime faithfully for 4 decades before being designated its enemy. This was the final form of Hoxha's system, a regime so thoroughly purged of potential opposition, so completely dominated by a single personality, so deeply invested in its own isolation, that it had become genuinely incapable of the normal functions of governance. The economy was stagnant. Living standards were among the lowest in Europe, lower than in the most backward regions of Romania or Bulgaria, which were themselves poor by European standards. Agricultural collectivization had undermined food production. The industrial plants built with Soviet and then Chinese aid were operating with obsolete technology and inadequate supplies. Albanian workers lived on ration cards, on fixed wages, on a system of distribution that provided basic subsistence but nothing more, and yet the system maintained its grip. The Sigurimi, the secret police, was omnipresent. Informant networks had penetrated every institution of Albanian society, every workplace, every apartment building, every family circle. People were careful what they said, careful what they read, careful about the music they hummed, careful about the jokes they told. The psychological burden of this constant vigilance was enormous, and its effects on Albanian social trust, the basic capacity to believe that the people around you were not reporting on you, would prove to be one of the most long-lasting and difficult legacies of the communist period. Hoxha died on April 11, 1985, after a long decline that had seen him increasingly absent from public life in his final years. He was 76 years old, and he had ruled Albania for 41 years. In those 4 decades, he had broken with Yugoslavia, the Soviet Union, and China. He had outlasted Stalin and Khrushchev and Mao and Brezhnev. He had survived multiple internal challenges and eliminated every potential successor except the one he chose. He had built a system of fortifications that covered every corner of his small country, and he had sealed that country so completely from the outside world that many Albanians in 1985 had only the vaguest conception of what life was like in the countries that were technically their neighbors a few hundred kilometers away. His designated successor, Ramiz Alia, took power and immediately faced the problem that every successor to a personal dictatorship faces: how to maintain a system whose coherence depended on a personality that no longer existed. Alia was a capable politician, more flexible, more pragmatic, less consumed by ideology than Hoxha, but he was operating within constraints that he could loosen only gradually, if at all. The party apparatus, the security services, the military, the system of ideological control, all had been built around Hoxha, and all continued to function in his absence, but with less conviction, less energy, less certainty about the purpose of what they were doing. The global context was changing around Albania with extraordinary speed. Gorbachev's reforms in the Soviet Union were producing ripple effects across the entire communist world. The economies of Eastern Europe were stagnating. The information that was leaking in through illegal satellite dishes and smuggled publications was giving Eastern Europeans an increasingly vivid picture of how much better life was in the West. The gap between what communist governments promised and what they delivered had become too wide to sustain. And when the Berlin Wall fell in November 1989, when the most visible symbol of communist division between East and West crumbled in a matter of hours before crowds of jubilant East Germans, the psychological impact on communist populations across the region was seismic. Albania seemed, briefly, immune. The borders remained sealed. The party apparatus remained in place. The nightly news continued to present Ramiz Alia's government as a stable, confident leadership managing Albania's ongoing socialist development. But underneath this surface stability, Albanian society was under enormous pressure, the pressure of isolation so complete and so long maintained that even the most loyal Albanians were beginning to wonder what, exactly, they had been isolated for. Enver Hoxha. The name deserves to be spoken carefully, because what it represents in Albanian history is genuinely difficult to categorize in the vocabulary of normal political description. He was not simply a communist dictator. There were many of those in the 20th century, and most of them, whatever their crimes, operated with some connection to the societies they ruled. Hoxha built something qualitatively different. a system so total, so paranoid, so committed to isolation from literally the entire world that it ultimately became a kind of experiment in what a society looks like when it is successfully cut off from all external contact and all internal dissent simultaneously. He was born in 1908 in Gjirokastër, the Greystone southern city that would later also produce Ismail Kaderi, Albania's greatest novelist and one of the finest European writers of the 20th century. The two men, the dictator and the writer, both came from the same city, and their relationship across the decades of communist rule would be one of the most remarkable negotiations between power and art in modern European history. But more on Kaderi in a moment. Hoxha was educated partly in France, was a francophone intellectual who had absorbed French communist and leftist ideas in the 1930s, and returned to Albania with both a political ideology and an extraordinary personal ambition. He was charismatic, intelligent, and ruthless in the way that only truly ideological men can be ruthless, not from sadism, primarily, though there was certainly capacity for cruelty, but from an absolute conviction that the end justified the means and that the means could be interpreted very broadly indeed. He took power in 1944 and held it until his death in 1985, 41 years. In that time he purged, imprisoned, or executed virtually every other significant figure in Albanian political life. He broke with Yugoslavia in 1948, following the Tito-Stalin split, and aligned with the Soviet Union. He broke with the Soviet Union in 1960 to 1961, when Khrushchev's denunciation of Stalin in pursuit of peaceful coexistence seemed to Hoxha like the grossest possible ideological betrayal, and aligned with Maoist China. He broke with China in 1978, when Mao's successors pursued the normalization of relations with the United States, which Hoxha saw as revisionism of the most treasonous kind, and retreated into a self-imposed isolation that had no precedent in modern history. Albania during the 1970s and 1980s had no formal diplomatic relations with the United States or the Soviet Union or any Western country except for limited connections. It was the only country in the world, or very nearly so, that had made isolation its explicit state policy. The ideological justification for this hermetic closure was Marxism-Leninism, specifically, the version of it that Hoxha claimed to derive purely from the classical texts, unsullied by the revisionist betrayals of Khrushchev, Mao, Tito, or anyone else. Albania, Hoxha insisted, was the only truly Marxist-Leninist state in the world. All others had either capitulated to imperialism or deviated from the pure doctrine. This was not false modesty, he meant it, or at least performed it with complete conviction, and the Albanian state under him operated as though it were genuinely true. The practical consequences of this ideology were staggering. Albania's borders were sealed more completely than any country not in active wartime. Albanian citizens could not leave except in the rarest of circumstances. Foreign travel was essentially impossible. Foreign radio broadcasts were jammed. Foreign books, even communist books from countries Albania had broken with, were forbidden. Owning a Bible or Quran was a criminal offense. In 1967, Hoxha declared Albania the world's first officially atheist state, closing all mosques and churches, some of which became storage facilities, gymnasiums, or were simply demolished. Religious practice of any kind was criminalized. People were imprisoned and in some cases executed for maintaining private religious observance. The campaign against religion was part of a broader cultural revolution explicitly modeled on Mao's Cultural Revolution in China, which was taking place simultaneously, that sought to destroy the remnants of pre-communist Albanian society and replace them with a purely Marxist-Leninist culture. The canon was attacked as a feudal relic. Traditional music and folk customs were scrutinized for counter-revolutionary implications. Intellectuals were sent to labor camps or to work in mines and factories as re-education. The Albanian Security Service, the Sigurimi, built a network of informants so pervasive that trust between neighbors, between co-workers, even between family members became a luxury that Albanian society could not afford. And then there were the bunkers. Starting in the late 1960s, Hoxha ordered the construction of a network of defensive fortifications across the entire territory of Albania. The project, which continued until the late 1980s, produced an estimated 700,000 to 750,000 individual concrete bunkers, mushroom-shaped structures designed to shelter 1 to 4 soldiers and provide a firing position against invasion. They dot the Albanian landscape with a density that is literally impossible to comprehend without seeing it, along the beaches, on hillsides, in fields, at crossroads, in city parks, at intervals along mountain ridges. One bunker for roughly every 4 Albanian citizens. A defensive infrastructure that consumed enormous quantities of concrete, steel, and labor that could have been used to build hospitals, schools, roads, or houses. Why? What enemy was Albania defending itself against with this insane fortification program? The answer, according to Hoxha, was everyone. The Americans were imperialists. The Soviets were social imperialists. The Yugoslavs were Titoite revisionists with territorial ambitions against Albania. The Greeks claimed Albanian territory. The Italians had invaded before. Encircled by enemies, ideologically alone in the world, Albania needed to be ready to resist invasion from any direction simultaneously. The bunkers were the physical expression of a paranoia that had become state policy. The tragedy is not simply that the bunkers consumed resources that Albanians desperately needed. The tragedy is that the entire bunker program rested on a fiction. Albania was not about to be invaded by anyone. Not by the Americans, who had no particular strategic interest in attacking a tiny, impoverished, isolated Balkan state. Not by the Soviets, who had their own problems. Not by the Yugoslavs, who were managing their own multi-ethnic federation with enough difficulty without adding Albania to it. The fortifications defended against enemies that existed only in Hoxha's increasingly disconnected view of the world. Hoxha's Albania was, in many ways, not so much governed as haunted by the fear of betrayal, by the specter of revisionism, by the certainty that capitalist and imperialist enemies were everywhere. Successive purges eliminated potential rivals. The purge of Interior Minister Kosi Zaks in 1949, who was accused of being a Yugoslav agent and executed. The purge of Defense Minister Bekir Baluku in 1974, accused of being a Chinese agent after the break with Beijing. The purge of Prime Minister Mehmet Shehu in 1981, or rather, the announcement of Shehu's suicide, which most historians believe was in fact murder, as the man who had been Hoxha's closest political collaborator for decades was posthumously accused of being simultaneously a CIA agent, a KGB agent, and a Yugoslav secret police operative. The circular logic of the accusations, how could one man serve so many rival masters simultaneously, was never addressed, because in Hoxha's Albania, the logic of accusation required no internal coherence. The accusation itself was the conviction. Life under Hoxha was not uniformly hellish in the way that life in Nazi death camps or Soviet gulags at their worst was hellish. There were periods of relative calm, years when the arbitrary terror retreated somewhat. There was universal education. Albania's literacy rate, which had been among the lowest in Europe at the start of the communist period, rose dramatically under Hoxha's emphasis on schooling. There was free healthcare. There was a genuine effort at industrialization, though it proceeded inefficiently and produced plants that were obsolete almost as soon as they were built. There was a degree of social equality, extreme privilege for the party elite, but also a certain leveling at the lower end of the social scale that meant the catastrophic rural poverty of the pre-communist period was somewhat ameliorated. But the price was total. You could not leave. You could not speak freely. You could not practice religion. You could not own a car. Private car ownership was essentially banned. You could not listen to foreign radio. You could not read foreign books. You could not choose your own profession or place of residence without party approval. You could not dissent. And if you were suspected of dissent, or if someone with a grudge against you accused you of dissent, you could disappear into the prison camp system of Spak or Kafbar, where conditions were brutal and from which a significant percentage of prisoners did not return. Ismail Kaderi navigated this world with extraordinary skill and extraordinary cost. His first major novel, The General of the Dead Army, published in 1963, drew on Albanian history and mythology in ways that the regime found usable for its own purposes. It was translated and published abroad, which gave Albania a cultural window that Hoxha found strategically useful. Kaderi continued to write, continued to publish, continued to win prizes internationally, and continued to work in the razor-thin space between what the regime found acceptable and what it found subversive. He was famous enough that liquidating him would have created an international embarrassment. He was careful enough not to provide explicit grounds for prosecution. He was also, in the assessment of many readers and critics, genuinely ambiguous. Some of his works functioned simultaneously as regime-compatible nationalist celebration and as coded critique that readers had to discover for themselves. Whether Kaderi was a collaborator, a resistor, or something in between that has no adequate name is a question that Albanians and scholars still argue passionately. What is not in question is that his novels, The Palace of Dreams, The Broken April, Chronicle and Stone, The Siege, and many others, constitute one of the finest bodies of literary work produced in Europe in the 20th century, and that they are inseparable from the Albanian experience of Hoxha's decades. They are the literature of survival. The literature of a people who found in story and in dream the inner life that the state could never quite reach. Hoxha died on April 11, 1985, after weeks of declining health. He was 76 years old, and he had ruled Albania for 41 years. He died in his bed, which was more than he had allowed most of his political enemies. His designated successor, Ramazalia, took power and immediately faced the problem that the entire system had been built around Hoxha's personal authority and that Hoxha was gone. The late 1980s were years of extraordinary global transformation.
Mikhail Gorbachev's perestroika and glasnost were restructuring the Soviet Union.
Communist regimes across Eastern Europe were falling with breathtaking speed. Poland in June 1989, Hungary in October, East Germany in November. The wall came down on November 9, 1989, a date that resonated across the communist world. Czechoslovakia in November, Romania in December, a revolution so swift that it seemed to consume itself in a matter of weeks. Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, and the various republics within it, all in motion, all transforming. Albania, sealed behind its extraordinary isolation, seemed untouched by these convulsions. Ramazalia maintained the essential structures of Hoxha's system while quietly relaxing some of the most extreme restrictions. Religion was cautiously rehabilitated. Some small openings to the outside world were permitted, but the fundamental architecture of the Albanian communist state, the party monopoly on power, the Sigurini's surveillance network, the sealed borders, remained in place into 1990. The dam broke in 1990. Thousands of Albanians sought refuge in foreign embassies in Tirana. The West German, Italian, Greek, and French embassies were stormed by crowds seeking asylum in a phenomenon that was both spontaneous and extraordinary, people simply walking into embassy grounds and refusing to leave until they were evacuated. The government, unable to manage the crisis, eventually permitted a mass departure that sent thousands of Albanians to Italy, to Greece, to anywhere outside. The images that reached Western television screens were simultaneously heartbreaking and revelatory. Young men and women sprinting across embassy lawns, climbing walls, throwing themselves over fences, desperate to reach a freedom that was, for the first time in their lifetimes, suddenly theoretically accessible. The Vlora incident of August 1991 became the defining image of this moment. A rusted cargo freighter called the Vlora, which had been returning from Cuba with a load of sugar, arrived in the port of Durrës. Within hours, word had spread through the city that the ship was in port, and then thousands of people, estimates range from 15,000 to 20,000, simply walked onto the docks and onto the ship. They climbed aboard by any means available. They packed themselves into every space on a vessel designed to carry perhaps a few hundred tons of cargo. The captain had no realistic choice but to sail. The Vlora crossed the Adriatic and arrived in the Italian port of Bari on August 8, 1991, carrying somewhere between 18,000 and 20,000 Albanian refugees. The Italian government, confronted with this sudden enormous human arrival, initially allowed the refugees to land and housed them in the Bari Stadium, a surreal, desperate encampment in the concrete bowl of a football ground. Then, calculating that receiving this many migrants would set an impossible precedent, Italy repatriated the vast majority within days, under circumstances that Albanians regarded as humiliating. People who had crossed the Adriatic on a rusted freighter in desperate hope of freedom were loaded onto Italian ships and taken back to the country they had just fled. The episode was painful and produced lasting resentment, but it was also a harbinger both of the scale of the Albanian will to emigrate and of the European ambivalence about receiving Albanian migrants that would characterize the relationship between Albania and its Western neighbors for the next 2 decades. The communist system formally ended with multi-party elections in March 1991, elections in which the communists still won, partly because the rural population remained loyal and partly because the opposition was barely organized, and then, more decisively with elections in March 1992, which the Democratic Party under Sali Berisha won in a landslide. Albania was, at last, formally a democracy. What that meant in practice was immensely complicated by the inheritance of 4 decades of communist rule. The institutions required for a functioning democracy: an independent judiciary, a professional civil service, a free press with trained journalists, political parties with genuine ideological roots and organizational capacity, a business class with experience in market economics, a civic society with the habits of public engagement. None of these existed in any meaningful form. They had been systematically destroyed or prevented from emerging during the communist period, and they could not be rebuilt in a matter of months or even years. The economic transition was equally brutal. The dismantling of communist economic structures, collective farms, state enterprises, central planning left enormous gaps that markets took years to fill, and during those transitional years, ordinary Albanians experienced poverty on a scale that felt worse than the communist period in some respects, because at least under communism the poverty had been universal and enforced, and there had been no alternative visible just across the Adriatic. Now there was an alternative visible. Satellite television had seen to that, and the gap between Albanian reality and Western possibility was agonizing. The young men who climbed onto the Vlora in 1991 were not irrational. They were responding to a completely rational calculation that opportunities in Italy, however uncertain, were vastly better than anything available in Albania. And that calculation drove one of the largest emigrations in 20th century European history. In the decade from 1990 to 2000, somewhere between a quarter and a third of Albania's entire population emigrated. The country that had been unable to prevent its citizens from leaving now found itself unable to persuade them to stay. The destinations were primarily Italy and Greece, close, accessible, where Albanian communities established themselves quickly and sometimes with considerable difficulty. Albanian immigrants in Greece in the early 1990s faced significant discrimination and hostility. They were associated in Greek public perception with crime and social disorder, a perception that was sometimes fair and more often the product of prejudice amplified by media coverage that focused on the minority of Albanian immigrants involved in criminal activity while ignoring the majority who were working quietly and honestly in construction, agriculture, and domestic service. The integration of Albanians into Italian and Greek society over the 1990s and 2000s was a gradual, often painful process that produced communities which are now, 20 to 30 years later, substantially integrated Albanian-born Italians and Albanian-born Greeks who speak the local language perfectly, who have raised children who often don't speak Albanian, who contribute substantially to their adopted economies and societies. The 1997 crisis, when it came, revealed how completely the institutional rebuilding of the early 1990s had failed. The pyramid scheme collapse was not simply a financial catastrophe, it was a revelation of how thoroughly corrupt and dysfunctional the Albanian state had become in just 5 years of nominal democracy. The Berisha government had either encouraged the pyramid schemes or at minimum failed to prevent them, either because of corruption or because the schemes were providing an economic stimulus that the government found politically useful. When they collapsed, the government's failure to respond effectively, its attempts to maintain control through emergency measures that it lacked the capacity to enforce, its unwillingness to accept responsibility, all of this turned the financial crisis into a political one, and the political crisis into armed insurrection. The images of 1997 Albania, of men with Kalashnikovs on the streets of Vlorë and Sarand, of burning government buildings in Tirana, of desperate families boarding whatever transport they could find to cross the Adriatic, were broadcast across the world and embedded in international memory an image of Albania as a failed state, as a country that couldn't hold itself together, as a place of chaos and violence. That image was unfair in many ways. It captured a real crisis but not the real complexity of Albanian society, its resilience, its fundamental capacity for reconstruction, but it was also, at that moment, not entirely wrong. The Italian-led Operation Alba that arrived in April 1997 was a genuine stabilization effort, and it worked well enough to allow elections to be held and a new government installed. The socialist party's return to power under Feto's Nano provided a different political dynamic. The socialists had their own problems of corruption and inefficiency, but they weren't the Berisha government, and the mere fact of their being different gave Albanian politics enough breathing room to avoid complete collapse. Kosovo was the next catastrophe, and in this one Albania was not the protagonist but the desperate witness and, ultimately, the refuge. To understand why Kosovo mattered so intensely to Albanians, why the Kosovo crisis of 1998 to 1999 was experienced not as a foreign humanitarian emergency but as something profoundly intimate, almost familial, you need to understand the historical and demographic relationship between the two entities. Kosovo, Kosova in Albanian, had been home to an Albanian majority population for centuries. The city of Prizren, where the League of Prizren had met in 1878, was a city of Albanian culture and history. Jakova, Farazet, these were Albanian cities, with Albanian neighborhoods, Albanian schools, Albanian mosques and traditions, that happened to be located in territory that Yugoslavia, and before it Serbia, claimed as sovereign. The Albanian population of Kosovo had grown steadily through the 20th century. By 1981, about 80% of Kosovo's population was Albanian, a proportion that increased further through the 1980s and 1990s. Milosevic's 1989 revocation of Kosovo's autonomous status, eliminating the protections that had allowed Kosovo Albanians to govern themselves through their own institutions within the Yugoslav framework, was experienced by Kosovo Albanians as a catastrophe. The systematic firing of Albanians from public sector jobs, the closing of Albanian language schools and the forcing of Albanian children into a parallel education system that met in private apartments, the deployment of Serbian police and military forces in numbers that made normal life for Albanian civilians a daily experience of humiliation and potential violence, these were the conditions that Kosovo Albanians lived under through the 1990s. The KLA, the Kosovo Liberation Army, emerged from this situation not as a product of external instigation, but as an internal response to the absolute failure of peaceful resistance to produce any result. Rugova's decade of Gandhi-inspired nonviolent resistance had produced no international response. No Serbian concessions, no improvement in conditions. The KLA offered an alternative, armed resistance, even at the cost of Serbian reprisals, on the calculation that only military pressure could force international attention. The Serbian security forces' response to KLA activity was exactly what the most cynical KLA strategist might have predicted. a campaign of collective punishment against Albanian civilians that, by 1998 and accelerating dramatically in 1999, had produced what the United Nations and every other international body capable of.
Judgment characterized as a humanitarian catastrophe.
Villages were burned, civilians were killed, hundreds of thousands of people were forced from their homes and began moving, on foot, in convoys of tractors, in whatever transport was available, toward the borders with Albania and North Macedonia. Albania received over 450,000 of these refugees in a country of barely 3 million people. This was equivalent to the United States receiving 45 million refugees in a matter of weeks.
The strain on Albanian infrastructure, on Albanian social services, on Albanian family resources was enormous. And yet the Albanian response, both governmental and personal, was one of the most remarkable humanitarian mobilizations in the region's modern history. Albanian families opened their homes. Albanian farmers shared their food.
Albanian businesses provided supplies and services at no charge. The Albanian diaspora worldwide raised funds that were channeled to refugee support. The sense of solidarity was not abstract or political, it was the solidarity of people who regarded the Kosovo Albanians as cousins, as family, as part of the same people who happened to have ended up on the wrong side of a border drawn by the great powers in 1913. NATO's air campaign against the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, which began in March 1999 and continued for 78 days, used Albanian territory as a critical operational base. Albanian airspace and Albanian infrastructure supported the campaign that ultimately forced Serbian forces to withdraw from Kosovo and accept a UN administration. When the bombing stopped and refugees began returning to Kosovo, many traveled back through Albania, the reverse journey, the return that almost nobody had dared to hope for during the desperate weeks of flight. The Kosovo question remains technically unresolved but practically settled. Kosovo declared independence in 2008, has been recognized by over 100 countries including the United States and most of the European Union,
and functions as an independent state.
The relationship between Albania and Kosovo is the closest between any two sovereign states in the world without them being the same state. Shared currency considerations, shared cultural institutions, virtually free movement of citizens, family connections that cross the border in both directions continuously. The political aspiration for some kind of formal unification exists in both countries, but it faces enormous practical obstacles: the preferences of the international community, the concerns of Serbia and its allies, the complexities of EU integration processes that treat Albania and Kosovo as separate candidates. For now, the connection is expressed more emotionally than institutionally. When Kosovo plays football, Albanians in Albania watch with the same intensity as if it were their own national team. When an Albanian politician needs to rally nationalist feeling, a reference to Kosovo's history and the shared sacrifice of 1999 reliably produces it. When a Kosovo-Albanian family visits Durrës or Tirana or the Albanian Riviera, they are visiting their own people in their own world, not a foreign country. It didn't collapse because of something that is very hard to quantify but very real in the Albanian experience: the diaspora. Albanian emigration, which had begun in the early 1990s and accelerated dramatically after 1997,
had sent hundreds of thousands of Albanians to Italy,
to Greece, to Germany, to the United Kingdom, to the United States and Canada. By the early 2000s, the Albanian diaspora was sending remittances back to Albania at a rate that represented a substantial fraction of the country's GDP. Estimates have ranged from 15 to 20% and higher at peak periods. These remittances, monthly wire transfers from an Albanian cleaning floors in Milan to his family in Fear, from an Albanian working construction in Athens to her parents in Kokes, from an Albanian running a restaurant in New York to her siblings in Tirana, sustained Albanian households through years when the domestic economy provided nothing remotely adequate. The diaspora also provided something harder to measure: hope, connection, information, models of how the world outside worked. Albanian children in the 1990s grew up with relatives who had seen Italy, who had worked in Greece, who had encountered the European Union's regulatory framework and the concept of a functioning bureaucracy and a state that actually provided services without expecting total submission in return. This knowledge flowed back into Albania in 1,000 informal ways. The early 2000s saw the beginning of what was, by Albanian standards, a remarkable period of stability. The Socialist Party under Feto's Nano and then the Democratic Party under Sali Berisha, alternating in power through elections that were contested and sometimes chaotic but increasingly accepted as basically legitimate, began the process of institutional construction that had been so badly disrupted by the 1990s. Infrastructure investment began, slowly, to improve roads and utilities. The EU Stabilization and Association process offered Albania a framework and a destination, eventual European Union membership, that provided both incentive and direction for the reform effort. Albania joined NATO in 2009, a milestone of extraordinary symbolic importance for a country that had spent 40 years as the most isolated state in Europe. The same country that had been the only explicitly atheist state in the world, that had been sealed behind concrete borders and 500,000 concrete bunkers, was now a member of the Western Military Alliance. The symbolism was almost too stark to be accidental. It felt like history making a deliberate point. The EU path has been slower and more difficult. Albania was granted EU candidate status in 2014, and accession negotiations formally opened in 2022, a process that, for context, typically takes many years and requires the candidate country to undertake comprehensive legal and institutional reforms across dozens of policy areas. Albania's accession journey has been complicated by persistent problems with corruption, organized crime, judicial independence, and the quality of public institutions, legacies of both the communist period and the chaotic 1990s that have proven remarkably resistant to reform efforts. The corruption problem is real and deeply embedded. Decades of communist rule had created a culture where the relationship between citizens and the state was fundamentally transactional, where nothing worked through official channels without some informal payment or personal connection, where the law was whatever the powerful said it was. Dismantling that culture and replacing it with something resembling a rule of law state has proven enormously difficult, requiring not just new laws but a change in deeply ingrained social behaviors and expectations. Progress has been made. The EU vetting process, which subjected all Albanian judges and prosecutors to stringent integrity scrutiny beginning in 2016, resulted in the removal of a substantial portion of the judiciary, revealing how deeply corruption had penetrated the legal system. But the path is long and the destination not yet certain. Albania's relationship with organized crime is similarly complex. The collapse of state authority in the 1990s, the flood of weapons, and the enormous diaspora all contributed to the emergence of Albanian criminal networks that became significant players in European drug trafficking, particularly the supply of cannabis and cocaine. The Shevdet Muko clan, the Badri clan, the Lushnja networks, names that European law enforcement agencies learned to recognize through the 2000s and 2010s as Albanian criminal organizations established themselves as sophisticated, transnational operations. Combating these networks from within Albania has been complicated by the same corruption problems that compromise the judicial system, and by the sheer difficulty of addressing organized crime in a state that is still building the institutional capacity that fighting organized crime requires. None of this is unique to Albania. Every post-communist transition society in Eastern Europe has grappled with versions of the same problems. Romania, Bulgaria, Kosovo, North Macedonia, all have faced the challenge of building functional states from the rubble of communist institutions, and all have had their EU integration complicated by corruption and rule of law deficits. But Albania's particular history, the exceptional isolation of the Hoxha period, the especially brutal nature of the 1997 collapse, the relatively thin tradition of pre-communist civic institutions, meant that it started the transition from a more difficult position than most. And yet, there is something happening in Albania in the 21st century that deserves attention, and not only in the context of its problems. There is construction, real construction, the kind that happens when an economy is growing. Tirana, which was a grey, shabby, undersupplied city as recently as the mid-1990s, has been transformed in the past 2 decades into a genuinely modern urban environment, with a newly completed grand boulevard lined with trees and government buildings, with restored Ottoman-era bazaars, with a burgeoning restaurant and cafe culture, with architecture that ranges from the Soviet brutalist legacy to experiments in postmodern color that have made Albanian urban design internationally known. The former mayor Edi Rama, who became prime minister in 2013 and has held power since, made his name as an artist who transformed Tirana's drab apartment facades with enormous painted murals, turning the grey buildings into a canvas for color and imagination. Albania's natural environment, long neglected and in some cases severely degraded by communist industrial policy, has become a genuine economic asset. The Albanian Riviera, the stretch of Ionian coastline from Vlora south to the Greek border, is one of the last genuinely undiscovered coastlines of the Mediterranean. With clear blue water, dramatic coastal cliffs, small fishing villages, and beaches that are as beautiful as anything the Greek islands or Croatian coast can offer, without the crowds or the prices. International tourism, which barely existed as a significant industry in Albania before the 2000s, has grown substantially, and the country now receives millions of visitors annually.
New hotels and tourism infrastructure are being built along the Riviera.
The ancient cities of Butrint, a UNESCO World Heritage Site on the southern coast, with Greek, Roman, Byzantine, and Venetian layers of archaeology visible in extraordinary concentration, and Apollonia draw archaeologically inclined tourists from across Europe. The Albanian American community, which has grown substantially since the 1990s migration wave, has produced politicians, businesspeople, academics, and artists who move between their adopted country and the homeland with increasing ease. The singer Dua Lipa, one of the most successful British pop artists of the 2010s, born in London to Albanian Kosovar parents, has used her global platform to speak about Albanian culture and identity in ways that have brought Albanian presence into mainstream international cultural conversation. Kosovo-Albanian footballer Zerdan Shaqiri, playing for Swiss national team, and Albanian-American players in various international competitions, have given the Albanian football diaspora a visibility that would have been unthinkable a generation ago. The Kosovo connection remains the most emotionally intense element of contemporary Albanian politics and identity. The two countries, Albania proper and Kosovo, are increasingly integrated economically and culturally, with free movement of citizens, shared cultural institutions, and a political relationship that is closer than any formal diplomatic framework would suggest. The natural unification of Albania and Kosovo is an idea that circulates in Albanian political discourse with varying degrees of explicitness. Most Albanian and Kosovar political leaders speak carefully about it, aware that formally proposing unification would alarm Serbia, Russia, and parts of the EU. But the cultural and emotional reality of Albanian Kosovar unity is not really in question. When the Kosovo national football team, which plays separately from Albania's, meets Albania's team, the atmosphere is nothing like a typical international match. It is more like a family gathering that occasionally involves tactics. The demographic trajectory of Albania is, however, one of the most challenging aspects of its contemporary situation. Emigration, which began as a desperate flood in the 1990s and has continued as a steady drain ever since, has removed perhaps a third or more of Albania's population from the country. Albania's population, which was approximately 3.3 million in 1990, had declined to perhaps 2.8 million by the 2020s, and the demographic composition of what remains has shifted toward older age groups as young people continue to leave for opportunities in Germany, the United Kingdom, Italy, and elsewhere in the EU. The brain drain is particularly acute. Doctors, engineers, academics, and other highly educated Albanians are among the most likely to emigrate, taking with them exactly the human capital that the country most needs for its development. This is not a problem unique to Albania, Romania, Bulgaria, Lithuania, and other EU member states with lower wages than Western Europe all face versions of the same demographic drain, but Albania faces it in acute form. And without the EU membership that at least gives other immigrant-sending nations a framework for eventually attracting their citizens back when economic conditions improve sufficiently, the political system has stabilized to the degree that elections occur, results are accepted, after some acrimony, and governments change. Prime Minister Edi Rama's Socialist Party has won 3 consecutive electoral victories in 2013, 2017, and 2021, which in a country where alternation of power was, for most of the 1990s and 2000s, accompanied by accusations of fraud and sometimes by violence, represents a kind of normalization. Whether Rama's long dominance represents healthy democratic consolidation or a drift toward soft authoritarianism is debated by Albanian political observers with considerable heat. The bunkers are still there. Most of them. 700,000 concrete mushrooms embedded in Albanian soil, rusting slowly, serving as chicken coops, wine cellars, mushroom farms, tourist attractions, pop-up cafes, and canvas for street art. A few have been converted into tourist sites. There is a bunker museum in Tirana, inside one of the original Hoxha-era command and control complexes. Removing them all is beyond Albania's current financial capacity, and so they remain the most visible reminder of what the Hoxha years meant, embedded in the landscape as the communist period was embedded in Albanian consciousness. You cannot look at the Albanian countryside without seeing them. You cannot understand what Albania is today without understanding what they represent. They represent a kind of absolute fear, the fear of a regime so convinced of the world's hostility that it spent decades and billions building defenses against an attack that never came, while the real attack was from within, from the system itself, from the paranoia that consumed the political class and the isolation that consumed the society. The bunkers are a monument to what happens when a state turns its energy entirely inward, when it converts its people's labor and sacrifice into defensive infrastructure against imaginary enemies rather than into the schools and hospitals and roads and opportunities that actual people actually need. They are also, increasingly, a kind of pride, not pride in the regime that built them, but pride in the endurance of the people who lived through it. Albanians who grew up playing in bunkers, hiding in bunkers during the 1997 violence, sheltering in bunkers during the Kosovo crisis, transforming bunkers into art. They have a relationship with these structures that is too intimate and too complex to be simple. It is the relationship of survivors with the evidence of what they survived, because that is what Albanian history is, ultimately a history of survival. Not passive survival, not resigned acceptance of whatever the world imposed, but fierce, adaptive, often costly survival that drew on deep reserves of stubbornness and identity that somehow persisted through Illyrian antiquity, Roman occupation, Byzantine fragmentation, medieval principalities, Ottoman rule, Italian fascism, Nazi occupation, communist isolation, democratic chaos, and the ongoing challenges of post-communist transition. The double-headed eagle on the Albanian flag is not just a heraldic symbol borrowed from Byzantine tradition. It is a statement about how a people sees itself, facing in two directions simultaneously, watchful on all sides, impossible to surprise from behind. It was Skanderbeg's symbol. It is the symbol of a nation that has learned, through 3,000 years of being attacked from every direction, to be alert and to be ready and to be still standing when the attack has spent itself. The oldest legend about the Albanian name says that Albanian means son of the eagle, from Shqipënj, the Albanian word for eagle. Linguists are skeptical of this etymology. The derivation is probably from the word for, to speak clearly, suggesting that Albanians were simply those who spoke comprehensibly to each other, as opposed to the incomprehensible foreigners around them. But the eagle etymology is older and more beautiful, and Albanians have preferred it, and perhaps that preference itself tells us something important: a people that chooses to be eagles rather than speakers, a people that chooses to see itself as sharp-eyed and aerial and difficult to cage. A people that spent 41 years in the most literal cage that modern history has produced, and emerged from that cage not broken, though damaged, not destroyed, though diminished, not without direction, though not yet arrived. The EU accession path continues. The roads improve, haltingly. The Riviera fills with tourists. The bunkers rust and are painted and slowly, very slowly, are repurposed into something livable. Young Albanians are born into a country that is neither the communist state their grandparents endured nor the chaotic transition space their parents navigated, but something genuinely new, imperfect, complicated, still finding its footing, but real. Tirana's newly rebuilt main boulevard stretches from the Mother Albania statue, which watches over the city from a hilltop with the slightly threatening authority of monuments to abstraction, down through the center of the capital toward the Skanderbeg Square, where the national hero's equestrian statue stands with his distinctive helmet and his raised sword, face tilted slightly upward toward something that might be the future or might simply be the sky. Behind him, the pyramid built as Hoxha's mausoleum and now being controversially repurposed as a technology and youth culture center rises from its peculiar geometric lines in a building that is an architectural argument with itself, neither fully demolished nor fully transformed. This is Albania, ancient and unfinished, traumatized and resilient, isolated for so long that it is still, in some ways, discovering what the world is like. Small enough to be easily overlooked, complicated enough to reward attention, proud enough to insist, in the end, that it matters. The eagle does not explain itself. It simply flies. For 3,000 years, through empires and occupations and revolutions and catastrophes, through every attempt to cage it or break it or simply ignore it, this particular eagle has kept flying. Battered, yes, grounded at times, shot at from every direction by every kind of shooter history could produce, but always, eventually, airborne again, always, in the end, the eagle.